But they're only the latest means of sending troops by air. The idea of the airborne soldier goes back a long way. They jumped into battle in their thousands by parachute. And that's perhaps why, because of their special skills, in most armies, the paras are regarded as a special and elite unit.
Soldiers dropping from the skies were a feature of World War II and Korea. Their chief weapon was surprise. Their fighting tradition was formidable, as it had to be, given the odds they faced. And it was the Germans who were the first to commit paratroopers to action en masse.
The parachute soldiers in any army in the world are always a certain elite. They stick together, they kept good discipline, and they had everywhere a wonderful spirit. Our soldiers, our non-commissioned officers, we commanders all together, we are one family. We meet, we were helping each other, are good comrades, are good soldiers, are trained to obey orders. Everybody wants to serve his country. There was a lot of patriotism.
All parachutists begin their training on the ground. They are hardened in careful steps to the shock of the jump, the slipstream, and the landing. They must also prepare for their type of operations with great care. By 1941, the German parachutists had taken part in two great campaigns, in the West and in the Balkans. And then in May of that year, they planned for their riskiest venture, the assault on Crete. Codenamed Mercury, the operation was to be the first attempt of the airborne age to seize a large objective with parachute troops.
As we saw Crete from the air, I was from time to time with these pilots in the cockpit and had a good view. We had quite clear weather. Naturally, everybody wants to show up that he is a proud soldier, but in fact, I wouldn't be honest if I was not admitting that everybody in fact was afraid. This was a situation where we started singing even. We admitted that all of us, we were afraid. And the singing in the plane was more or less show business. You give each other courage.
We dropped down like, how shall I say, like a bag of potatoes. We always had to stand, hold on the door, and jump head first. Spread your arms, keep yourselves in a balance, jump out towards the wing. You're frightened. Everybody is frightened, but you hope for that bang. Once you're out, you hear that bang on top of you, and that's a relief. Your chute is open.
But a safe landing is not enough to make a parachute jump a success. The individual paratrooper has to begin fighting hard as soon as he hits the ground.
The individual is more important than the unit after landing in the first, say, 20 minutes. You must have good soldiers, weak boys and so, and they don't have an aim and they are no patriots, you can forget them. And there was the most heavy fighting. The biggest fighting was around the airport in Mallemes.
The airport was the key. The Germans finally took it and opened the way for their transport aircraft to bring in reinforcements. Had the British held the airport, they could have isolated the German parachutists and destroyed them at leisure. As it was, supported by stronger forces, the Germans went on to the offensive and victory.
We occupied at least this hill of Mallemes, and then more or less the whole island was in our hand. But we had heavy losses. And I think the whole German general staff was astonished about these losses. I think the whole airborne philosophy was changed after this experience of Crete.
So heavy were the German losses that Hitler never again risked using his elite airborne divisions in mass drops.
Welcome back to Demon Forces 5, Part 2. Now we're going to switch things up a little bit today. As promised, we are going to start talking about Charles Taylor's arms dealers. This is something that's going to have to be explored in multiple episodes. So today, we're just going to focus on the first one. Now, when I stumbled across this individual's name, probably around 2016, I had already been familiar, or I thought I was deeply familiar, with the general outlines of Charles Taylor's story. But then I stumbled across a somewhat obscure book called A Shadow World, Inside the Global Arms Trade, by South African author and former MP Andrew Feinstein. And Feinstein, to my knowledge, is the only author to actually make the explicit connection between Charles Taylor and the man we are about to start talking about, a shadowy German, the man you just heard in the intro, recounting somewhat wistfully his experiences as an elite Nazi paratrooper in World War II, named Gerhard Mertins. Now, if you're a longtime listener of Subliminal Jihad, you may remember that name being brought up once before in Contra 6 when we were talking about BCCI. I speculated, though I still have not been able to really pin it down, that the quote-unquote high German arms dealer Heinrich, that's not his real name, who is, I think in the book The Outlaw Bank, bears an incredible similarity to Gerhard Mertins on a variety of levels. But when I discovered this man's involvement in the Liberian Civil War, it turned everything that I thought I knew or understood about it on its head, and it opened up a whole new web of connections that, when put together, start to paint a very different picture about what really went on in the Liberian Civil War and who really were the driving, catalyzing forces behind it. There's a lot more I have to say about it, but I think the best place to start would be with Feinstein's book, Shadow World. And I just want to note before I start reading from this that the overall thrust of Shadow World is an examination of the global arms trade. And I would say that a huge focus of Feinstein's throughout is the Saudi royal family and the Al Yamama deal with British BAE, which, as he quite ably lays out, was one of the biggest and most corrupt arms deals of all time. But he splits his time talking about these big corrupt arms deals between nations and big corporations and defense contractors, and also talking about the even dirtier and bloodier and more corrupt world of small arms dealing, particularly in what many people regard as its golden decade, the 1990s. So I just want to clarify that this book is not about Liberia. However, he mentions a number of times and actually provides some very valuable original research in using Liberia as an example or a particularly brutal case study in the fruits of the Shadow World. So, I'm going to read you a little bit from Chapter 2, which is, I think, quite appropriately titled The Nazi Connection. And don't be surprised if you see quite a few familiar names and faces pop up that we've discussed before on this show. So, Feinstein writes, where large British and American firms became the pinnacle of the formal trade in arms, a small German company run by an affable, rotund former Nazi represented the murkiest depths of the Shadow World, the borderland between the legal and illegal trade in weapons. Merex had its genesis in early June 1945, just over a month after Adolf Hitler had committed suicide, as two men sat on a veranda in Wiesbaden in West Germany. One, General Reinhard Gehlen, was a German prisoner of war who had turned himself over to the Allies a month previously. The other was John R. Boker, Jr., an American officer in military intelligence, whose task it was to interrogate senior German operatives captured by the Allies. Together they discussed an arrangement that would have deep ramifications for both Germany and the world's future. to secure the survivors of Nazi Germany's wartime intelligence in service of the West. For Gehlen and the wide network of operatives he directed, the Second World War had been but a prefiguring of the great global conflict to come. In May 1942, Gehlen was appointed as the chief of the Fremde Heer Ost, Foreign Armies East, the intelligence branch of the German General Staff on the Eastern Front. His experience there was eye-opening. A committed Nazi, Gehlen was nevertheless forced to admit that Germany's chances of winning the war were slim. Directly appraised of the methods and might of the Soviets, Gehlen confided in his Fremde Heer Ost colleague, Lieutenant Colonel Gerhard Mertins, that the end of the conflict would bring into sharp relief what the exigencies of war had hidden, that the next decades would witness a severing of the world in two, the West on one side and the East on the other. More importantly, the East-West conflict would spare none, demanding allegiances without option. Quote, "It would be essential to ally with one side or other. No neutral position was possible," Faisal recalled in a later statement given to U.S. authorities. Caught between two global forces, Gehlen and Faisal chose the West. Coming to this realization, Gehlen and his organization made plans. Large dossiers of German intelligence on Soviet activities, which included surveillance photos of Russian industrial complexes and detailed intelligence on the capacity of the Soviet Air Force, were consolidated and hidden, often in makeshift holes beneath the floorboards of foresters' cottages. When the time came, Gehlen and his colleagues would present themselves to the Allies, offering up their cash in return for lenient treatment. It was a deal that John R. Boker Jr. felt was good value. Convinced of the quality of German intelligence, Boker oversaw the reconstitution of the hidden files and scoured POW camps to reunite Gehlen with his former colleagues. Fearful that U.S. authorities with a less sympathetic approach to Nazi officers would scupper his plans, Boker did what he could to hide his activities and protect Gehlen's organization. In August, Gehlen and a number of high-ranking colleagues were transported under Boker's watch to Washington in the private plane of a U.S. general, and from there to the Pentagon. After initially being placed in solitary confinement, within a year, having impressed U.S. intelligence, who trained him intensively, Gehlen was returned to Germany to head a massive U.S.-backed German spy ring to monitor Russian activities. Over the next decade, the U.S. poured an estimated $200 million into the ring, known colloquially as the Gehlen Org. In 1955, now staffed by thousands of undercover agents, Gehlen Org was formally handed over to the German government and integrated into the newly created West German intelligence agency, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the BND. Gehlen, the star of German intelligence, would head the BND until his retirement in 1968. For his part, John R. Boker, who had become a world-renowned stamp collector in his private life, was given belated recognition for his foresight when he was inducted into the Hall of Fame of Military Intelligence in 1990. Gehlen's soft landing following the war was matched by other prominent Nazis, many of whom formed a post-war nexus of contacts that frequently fed into the activities of Gehlen Org and the BND. In what was probably not an uncommon discovery, a BND employee was found to have been a prominent member of an SS unit responsible for the liquidation of 24,000 civilians in Russia, mostly Jews. Befitting these sordid origins, this network traded in the depraved, torture training, mercenary services, and most notably, arms dealing. Gerhard Mertins was one such character who emerged from the rubble of the war unscathed and would make hay from his contacts within the Gehlen group. Mertins had excelled during the war, rising to the rank of major in the Wehrmacht. In 1944, he was awarded the Knight's Cross, one of only 7,000 German soldiers to receive the honor, for acts of bravery during the unsuccessful attempts to repel the Allies' D-Day invasion. Despite appearing a happy, easygoing man, always ready to help, Mertins was also shrewd and, quote, cheated everybody, according to a close associate. Soon after the war, he took up a position at Volkswagen, a company with an impeccable Nazi pedigree. Little is known of his activities until the early 1950s, although it is almost certain that he kept curious company. According to U.S. Army intelligence documents, Mertins was the leader of the Bremen branch of the Green Devils, a group of Second World War parachutists agitating for a rearmed Germany. The branch included a number of suspected war criminals, as well as General Kurt Student, the man responsible for masterminding the German invasions of Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Closely connected to neo-Nazis of all stripes and unrepentant about his right-wing views, Mertins was more than comfortable with the considerable neo-Nazi sentiment evident in Germany after the war. For instance, he invited Otto Ernst Remmer, founder of the Socialist Reich Party, SRP, in 1950, to address members of his veterans group in Bremen. The SRP's platform was almost indistinguishable from Hitler's and included denial of the Holocaust. Mertins was, quote, considered to be an important SRP sympathizer who U.S. intelligence believed, quote, will aid the party financially. Mertins' connections to the world of veterans and ex-Nazis was to stand him in good stead when he decided to leave the employ of Volkswagen. In September 1952, he traveled to Egypt to participate in a bizarre project that was to provide an entree to the world of arms dealing. In 1948, the Egyptian army had been humiliated in a war with the newly created State of Israel. The response of the then Egyptian ruler, King Farouk, was to hire a number of ex-military Germans to assist in training his troops, allegedly with the tacit support of both the CIA and Gehlen Org. When Mertins arrived in Egypt in September 1951, he became a top aide to one of the group's leaders, the former Wehrmacht general Wilhelm Farnbacher, like Mertins, a recipient of the Knight's Cross. When the young general Gamal Abdel Nasser led a coup against King Farouk in July 1952, he turned to the Germans who had been training his erstwhile enemy's forces to create his own intelligence and security network in order to consolidate power. Seamlessly shifting their allegiance from King Farouk, the German detachment set about their new task, still with the backing of the CIA and Gehlen Org. The training was led by Otto Skorzeny, a notorious ex-Nazi who had been part of an elite unit that helped Mussolini escape from Allied jails during the war. Feinstein is referring there to the 1943 Gran Sasso raid, where General Kurt Student and Otto Skorzeny and a group of commandos used hang glider planes to rescue Mussolini from jail. In fact, I don't think he mentions this, but Gerhard Mertins was one of the paratroopers on that mission that rescued Benito Mussolini. Skorzeny himself escaped from a U.S. prison camp in 1948, possibly with a wink from U.S. intelligence services, and joined the like-minded Spanish dictator General Francisco Franco. Skorzeny set himself up as an agent for various Spanish arms companies, most notably Alpha. I'm just going to stop right there and repeat that Skorzeny set himself up as an agent for various Spanish arms companies. Remember those high-tech weapons Charles Taylor got from Spain that David Charles Miller talked about? Could be nothing. But anyways, Mertins was in contact with Otto Skorzeny in 1954 to discuss a potential arms deal that Skorzeny was negotiating with Nasser. While it is unlikely that Mertins was, quote, at the right hand of King Farouk, as he boasted in a rare 1968 interview, he was certainly less ideologically disposed towards Nasser, especially when the Egyptian Prime Minister moved towards the Soviets for support. Mertins left his Egyptian posting, but remained active in the Middle East during the mid-1950s. He trained parachute regiments in Syria and worked as a sales agent for a number of German firms throughout the region. His most notorious employer was a company run by one Herbert Quandt, for whom Mertins sold Mercedes-Benz vehicles in the Middle East, most notably 500 wine-red cars to the officer corps of Saudi Arabia. Quandt, who had served in the same parachute regiment as Mertins, also had impeccable Nazi credentials. His mother, Magda, had married Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, and committed suicide in the presence of Hitler in the Führer's bunker as the war came to an end. So yes, Mertins worked for the stepson of Joseph Goebbels. As a result of his activities in the region, Mertins was considered a potentially useful intelligence asset. He was approached by U.S. Army intelligence during the mid-1950s and immediately put on the payroll. His job was to provide his new friends with information about the Middle East gleaned from his work as a salesman. It was the first time, but certainly not the last, that Mertins made money from his relationship with intelligence services. Mertins returned to Germany in the late 50s and attempted unsuccessfully to rejoin the German army. However, his disappointment was soon forgotten in the excitement of a lucrative offer. Reinhard Gehlen asked Mertins to act as the middleman for German arms sales to the Third World. Gehlen would assist Mertins with intelligence about potential clients and help him to arrange the necessary papers, end-user certificates, and export licenses, which are essential to any arms deal. Germany at the time was hoping to remilitarize. The thinking was that in addition to using arms to peddle influence, selling its old surplus stock would raise much-needed money for the new arms purchases. For this purpose, in 1963, Mertins established a new company, Merex, which was jointly based in Bonn and Vevey in Switzerland. He suggested that the name had been intended as a contraction of Mercedes Export, despite the fact that it was, quote, not connected with the car company. Humility might have prevented him from admitting that it could just as easily be a syncopation of Mertins Export. Now, coming up here is a name drop of another individual that we might circle back to later, who, like most of these arms dealers, has an incredibly shady and colorful background with some very interesting connections. But Feinstein goes on. The company boss, Mertins, soon forged a crucial new contact to add to his large intelligence network. In 1965, Merex was hired as the German sales agent for Interarms, the international armament corporation run by the infamous Sam Cummings, who is sometimes referred to as the new Basil Zaharoff, and delighted in pointing out that his house in Monte Carlo was close to the former Zaharoff home. Cummings had served as a lieutenant with U.S. Army Secret Services during the Second World War, after which he was recruited as an undercover agent for the CIA, with responsibility to buy up surplus German weapons on the black market. He had formed Interarms in 1953 at the tender age of 26 and proceeded to make a fortune with help from the CIA. In 1954, he undertook his first major CIA-sponsored mission to supply arms to a right-wing coup in Guatemala. 3 years later, Interarms supplied weapons to the forces of Fidel Castro in Cuba, a transaction sanctioned by the CIA. It was believed that by supplying Castro with arms, the U.S. may have been able to keep the bearded revolutionary on side, a spectacular, if not uncommon, case of misplaced strategic thinking and blowback. Together, Mertins and Cummings were a formidable arms-dealing force. In 1965, they worked together to sell 74 U.S.-made F-86 fighter planes to Venezuela, 54 of which were surplus German stock, and a further 20 procured from active Luftwaffe service. It was a hugely profitable deal. The planes from surplus German stock were bought at a price of $46,400 each and sold to the Venezuelan Air Force for $141,000 per plane, netting a total profit of $6.926 million, which Cummings claimed was transferred in its entirety to Mertins. The deal was riven with corruption. The following year, Merex sealed a series of controversial deals that would almost spell an end to Mertins' nascent career as an arms dealer. Zaharoff-like, he sold fighter planes to both sides in South Asia, one of the world's less stable regions at the time. The first involved the sale of 90 F-86 aircraft to Pakistan, once again raised from surplus German stock. At the time, Pakistan was a no-sale zone, embargoed by NATO because of its simmering conflict with India. The required subterfuge was undertaken with the help of the Shah of Iran, who allowed the planes to be delivered to Tehran by Luftwaffe officers and then flown to Pakistan by Iranian pilots dressed up as Pakistani officers. Mertins sold the weapons to Pakistan even though Merex had a standing order with India. In August 1965, India had placed an order with the company for 28 Seahawk Mk-100s and 101s, old subsonic jets that had been used by the Luftwaffe and were now considered surplus. When the India-Pakistan War erupted that year, both countries were embargoed. But in June 1966, Mertins was given the go-ahead by German authorities to sell the planes to a company in Italy. He leased a ship, the Billetal, to transport his cargo. It set sail from the tiny German port of Nordenham, and once in the Mediterranean passed straight through Italian territorial waters and wound its way down the Suez Canal and landed in India. Purchased for a reported $625,000 by Merex, the jets were sold for $875,000, raising a profit of around 5 million Deutschmarks. At precisely the same time the Billetal was carrying cargo for Merex to India, its sister ship, the Verital, was on its way to Pakistan, traversing much the same route in order to deliver Cobra anti-tank rockets sold to Pakistan by Merex. The Verital made a second delivery on the same trip, docking in Iran, where the ship disgorged its cargo of missiles, cannons, machine guns, and other materiel. An Iranian end-user certificate, signed by the country's envoy to Germany, gave the deal legitimacy. But, as with the Pakistan deal, the cargo was instead rerouted to Saudi Arabia, a country with whom Germany had severed diplomatic ties a year previously. This time the cargo was valued at 12.58 million Deutschmarks. Mertins' duplicitous adventures were leaked to the media. An intensive campaign in Swiss newspapers persuaded Mertins that he was no longer welcome in the country. The news was also met with outrage in the US, as the planes sold to Pakistan were ex-US stock given to Germany after the war. As often happens in such deals, the providing country retains the right to veto any deal to sell the weaponry on. Selling to Pakistan during a period of conflict was a violation of US and international law. Congressional hearings were held under the chairmanship of Senator Stuart Symington. Mertins was not called, but instead met Symington privately, but Sam Cummings was forced to appear before the assembled politicians, where he confirmed Symington's astonishing finding that, quote, "Our own intelligence services knew exactly at that time that these F-86s were meant for Pakistan." As Congress was holding hearings into the Pakistan deal, the FBI was investigating whether Merex should be registered as an agent of the West German government. After considerable paperwork had been collected indicating that Merex was in constant contact with the U.S. Departments of State and Defense, Army intelligence intervened to ensure that the company was not registered as an agent, lest it lose its secrecy and anonymity. Quote, "The Army has opposed registration of Merex or Mertins as a former agent on any basis which could jeopardize their continued use." With U.S. Army intelligence in his corner, Mertins decided to establish an American branch. Merex Corporation was set up in a home in Bethesda, Maryland, just north of D.C. In an interview granted as the hearings into his South Asian activities was taking place, Mertins indicated his closeness to the U.S. establishment by referring openly to Henry J. Cuss, the man who approved or rejected the sale of surplus weapons gifted by the U.S., by his first name. Unfazed by possibly negative press, Mertins distributed Merex memorial calendars, replete with stirring pictures of heavily armed soldiers entering combat, reflecting the experiences of both the, quote, new and the old Germany. The opening of the U.S. branch was the final nail in the coffin of the brief but profitable relationship between Mertins and Sam Cummings, which had begun to sour after the Pakistan deal became public. Previously, Interarms had acted as Mertins' agent in the U.S., but this was no longer necessary. They relinquished their agency commitments to each other and engaged in some less than flattering portrayals to the press. Mertins was often quoted belittling Cummings' legendary self-aggrandizement. Quote, "I know him. He's Cassius Clay, the greatest. I've heard it all. He's a scrap dealer. He keeps files the way he learned as a corporal. Merex is not on the level of scrap." Ironically, when Mertins lost his sympathetic contacts with the German establishment, Cummings was the one to take advantage, signing a joint agency deal with Mertins' replacement, a company led by a former Nazi lieutenant general, Gerhard Engel, who had served as Hitler's adjutant. Mertins installed a close friend, Gerhard Bausch, as the CEO and president of the company, although Merex Corp remained entirely owned by the European business. Bausch, who had initially run the company from his basement, came with his own very useful connections. Much like Mertins, he had carved a useful niche for himself in the operations of German intelligence. In 1962, on Reinhard Gehlen's instructions, he was named station chief in Mertins' old stomping ground, Cairo. He was briefly arrested in 1965, suspected of involvement in a plot with Wolfgang Lotz, a joint German-Israeli agent, who was discovered forwarding information to Mossad from Egyptian generals unhappy with Nasser, while also sending letter bombs to German scientists who were working with the Egyptian ruler. Bausch was eventually freed after 3 trips to Egypt by Hans Heinrich Vorgitsky, the vice president of German intelligence. Even with Bausch's connections, Mertins' relationship with the German intelligence cooled after the Pakistan deal, for which he eventually faced criminal charges. It hardly helped that at around the same time Mertins also completed the sale of 6 million rounds of ammunition to the Nigerian government, soon after West Germany had officially stopped supplying the country after a military takeover. Nigeria was increasingly moving towards the Soviets, who would supply arms without fuss, so Mertins was providing ammunition to a Soviet-linked state in defiance of his own government. With his German government links in a fragile state, Mertins began to pursue other avenues and continents in search of new sales. In some cases, he was helped by connections to U.S. intelligence. In 1972, for example, just over a decade after leaving Egypt because of political differences, Mertins was called in by General Sadiq, a trusted lieutenant of the new Egyptian leader Anwar Sadat. The Egyptians were frustrated by the slow pace with which Soviet supplies had been delivered. At a meeting with Mertins in Egypt, General Sadiq asked the weapons dealer to sound out U.S. officials as to whether they would be willing to step into the breach if the Soviets were expelled. Also on the table was a potential deal for bridging equipment supplied by Merex. But it was in South America where Mertins was able to secure most of his new deals using, once again, his enduring Nazi connections. Now strap yourself in, because this is about to get even crazier. Feinstein writes, in Peru, Mertins appointed Comercial Agricola as Merex's local representative in the country. The company was run by Fritz Schwend, who during the Second World War had been part of Operation Bernhard, a madcap scheme to undermine the British economy by flooding the UK market with masses of counterfeit pounds. Schwend had, like many Nazis, escaped post-war justice and settled in Peru. He and Mertins were assisted by Otto Skorzeny. Skorzeny struck up a close relationship with Peruvian intelligence, which led to a request for M14 tanks. Mertins' South American network included other, even more extreme Nazis, such as Hans Rudel and Klaus Barbie. A fanatical right-winger, Rudel frequently traveled to Germany in the early 50s to speak at the behest of the Freikorps, of which he was, quote, patron. The Freikorps was, quote, the most flagrantly nationalistic right-wing organization in Western Germany since the Nazi Party, adhering closely to the policies of the Nazi regime, even to advocating return to a dictatorship. But the most notorious of Mertins' South American cabal was Klaus Barbie, nicknamed the Butcher of Lyon, and a close friend of Fritz Schwend. Barbie personally oversaw the torture and killing of 4,000 residents of occupied Lyon during the war, including a group of Jewish orphans he had ferried to concentration camps. After the war, Barbie worked for U.S. intelligence before settling in Bolivia. In fact, the U.S. aided his move to South America after French authorities had discovered his whereabouts. Barbie's depraved skills proved useful to Bolivia's military dictators. During the reign of Hugo Panzer, Barbie was hired to set up internment camps for political opponents, where torture and executions were commonplace. Usefully for Mertins, Barbie also became the dictatorship's official weapons purchasing agent. In February 1968, Schwend wrote to Mertins to inform him that Barbie's company, Transmaritima, was looking to buy used ships for the Bolivian Navy. Although it is unclear whether the deal took place, Mertins certainly intended to help. The request to speak to Barbie was forwarded to Merex's Naval Department. Mertins' deepest and most profitable connection in South America, however, was with Chile. Merex first entered the Chilean market in 1971 when Gerhard Bausch traveled to the country to sell $800,000 worth of bridles and saddles to the Chilean cavalry, as well as 20,000 rounds of ammunition. Their point man was an influential and ambitious general, Augusto Pinochet, who took power in an infamous coup 2 years later, supported by the U.S., and in which the democratically elected president, Salvador Allende, was either murdered or compelled to commit suicide. Mertins was delighted that the country was in the hands of a virulently anti-communist strongman, and frequently traveled to Chile, where he witnessed Pinochet's propensity for violence and torture. Now, this is something that really made my head spin. During these visits, Mertins often stayed at Colonia Dignidad, a German community camp based in the southern Andes. He was so impressed with the colony that he formed the Circle of Friends in Germany to raise funds for it. Colonia Dignidad was no ordinary community. It was formed in 1961 by yet another ex-Nazi, Paul Schaefer, a German priest who had fled his home country after being accused of child molestation. The camp was heavily fortified, watched over by guard towers, and protected by barbed wire, as much to keep residents in as visitors out. The community mixed bizarre social values, autarky and a German agrarian lifestyle from the 1930s, with the fervor of a self-styled militia. When Colonia Dignidad was eventually closed down at gunpoint after Pinochet's overthrow, a massive weapons cache was discovered, which included private handguns, grenade launchers, and a buried tank. A secret warren of tunnels had been constructed under the colony, featuring torture rooms allegedly designed by Michael Townley, a CIA operative who worked closely with the Chilean secret police, DINA. DINA, which maintained regular radio contact with Colonia Dignidad, used the rooms to torture political opponents, often, quote, to the strains of Wagner and Mozart. The well-stocked facility was also alleged to be a laboratory for the development and testing of biological weapons, which may have been used on those tortured. When the colony was finally raided, it was clear that Schaefer also engaged in the ritual molestation of young boys forced to stay at Colonia Dignidad, a charge on which he was found guilty in absentia by Chilean courts in 2004. Now, I could easily spend the next 2 hours talking about nothing but the horrors of Colonia Dignidad. Feinstein summarizes it quite well, but it is a truly shocking story. If people want to get a better sense of it, there's a, I think, 6-part Netflix series called Colonia Dignidad, a sinister sect, that came out over the last few years, and I think episode 5 has some archival footage of Gerhard Mertins in it. But I do want to dedicate a few moments to meditate on the ramifications of Gerhard Mertins' close involvement with Colonia Dignidad. This is not only a Nazi pedophile cult compound that systematically tortured Chilean leftists after Pinochet came to power. It is all those things, but I think it's important to stress that Colonia Dignidad was in many ways the nerve center of the international underground Reich, including some of the most notorious fugitive Nazi war criminals from World War II, people like Martin Bormann and Joseph Mengele. So I just want to play you a few minutes from an old tape from 1979, less for the factual content, but more for the way that Colonia Dignidad is talked about in relation to another tragic South American compound in the late 70s, Jonestown. And that tape is, of course, from someone I consider to be sort of the parapolitical godmother of this show, Mae Brussell. So here is Mae Brussell talking about Colonia Dignidad in 1979 and its connections to both the CIA, the Nazi underground, and the People's Temple tragedy. And pay particular attention to Mae Brussell's inklings that Colonia Dignidad was being used as a major hub for Nazi MKUltra experiments, and the similarity to some claims that came out of Jonestown that one of the purposes of that compound was programming mostly Black Americans to be drugged up, brainwashed killers, including children. So if Mae Brussell's suspicions were correct, and generally her suspicions were correct, and most of these assertions were proven after the camp was shut down in the 90s, after Pinochet was forced out of power. But there is an immense dracularity to the notion that this Nazi arms dealer who was bankrolling Colonia Dignidad, a hotbed of bioweapons research, torture, brainwashing, psychological cult experiments, pedophilia, arms trafficking, you name it, that about 15, 20 years later, that same guy would be the person putting AK-47s into the hands of 11, 12, 13, 14-year-olds in West Africa, the majority of whom are hopped up on cheap amphetamines, cane juice, and marijuana, and certainly are behaving, many of them at least, like they're programmed to kill.
This is Mae Brussell, tape number 385, April 20th, 1979, and it's side 2 of the tape. Now, to go back more to Colonia Dignidad. Aftermath, a book by Ladislav Fargo. I've used references from that book before on the escape of Martin Bormann from Nazi Germany by way of the Vatican. His passport written with the help of the Grand Mufti. You have those tapes. In the book, Aftermath, on page 466, it describes how Martin Bormann, when he finally gets over to South America, lived in Chile a great deal of the time. And this page says that Martin Bormann, the Nazi war criminal, moved to Chile and stayed at Colonia Dignidad. This was the property, the ranch or farm, that housed Nazis after World War II. Colonia Dignidad was a center of Das Reich, an organization of Nazis in Chile, made up of the Nazis, many of the Nazis from World War II. Das Reich made it possible as an organization for a man named Walter Rauff, R-A-U-F-F, to live in Chile. He was a German citizen who invented the death trucks for concentration camps, known to have killed at least 100,000 Jews, and he was allowed to remain in Chile, and he was one of the people that associated down there with Martin Bormann. For those of you who don't know who Martin Bormann is, I'm always surprised at some who don't, but if this is the first tape you get with his name on it, he's the man who directed the Jewish extermination program in Germany and was given passports by the Vatican to leave after the war. He wasn't tried as a war criminal. And in the 60s, he lived in Colonia Dignidad. This was that private agricultural center that was to become a youth cult front, later for torture and experimentation, but the front was the orphanage. Now, when he was in Colonia Dignidad in the 1960s, in the early 60s, that's the time that Jim Jones was in Brazil with the Central Intelligence Agency, and Dr. Mengele, the famous surgical experimenter on various persons, went down to South America to continue his experiments. I understand he's still doing them on the Indians down in Paraguay, that he is continuing his Nazi experimentations there. But Jim Jones went from Indiana down to Brazil and was with the Central Intelligence Agency making trips out of Brazil, traveling around while he was stationed in Brazil in 62 to 63. And when he returned on his way home, he stopped at Matthews Ridge, which was later, or even then, a CIA center. And he stopped there in 63, and then later Matthews Ridge was just 30 miles from the property that Jones rented. But he saw the land in 63 and returned with $100,000 to begin his own camp, and he took that $100,000 that he brought home and began his own care center up in Mendocino in Redwood Valley in California. So that the same years that Martin Bormann was at Colonia Dignidad, Jim Jones was in Brazil. And the parallels between Jonestown and Colonia Dignidad are just in this one article, short article, so many. And the common denominator here of the CIA and Kissinger, Brzezinski, and the government interfering with these land agricultural centers is overwhelmingly sinister. And the reason it was so interesting for me to read the article, and then just as a footnote, the author brings in the question of Colonia Dignidad and aftermath and Martin Bormann living there. He only brought that in as a footnote and not beginning the article with it. Astounded me because, as those of you who have the past tapes, and if you don't have them, you can get tape number 379, March the 9th, I did a review of a book called Treason for My Daily Bread by Michael Lebedev. And the allegations in this book were that Martin Bormann, Hitler's top director, escaped to Paraguay after World War II. Now, in this book, it tells how he hired a man who was to work with the assassin and escort him from New Orleans to Dealey Plaza, where the man would do the fatal headshot that blew off John Kennedy's brains over behind the fence. And the allegations of the book that this trained assassin, who went by the codename Zed, was hired by Martin Bormann. Now, that would make sense if Martin Bormann was directing trained assassins or programming assassins to erase their memory, because I also made a tape in August of '77 that there was a place in Guyana called Jonestown where Jim Jones could be running this school for assassins and experimenting on their brains to erase their memory. That it could be a continuation of the Nazi school in Mexico, in Oaxaca, Mexico. The cover of that place was broken in 1970 when the Torbett document came out. And the point being that if Bormann is at a place called Colonia Dignidad, which becomes an experimental agricultural farm with an orphanage Christian cover, but is a place for interrogation and torture and body experimentation. It's very interesting that this same Bormann operation that is going on in Chile has so many parallels of persons and relationships to the Jonestown Nazi operation that has been compared to a fascist Nazi concentration camp. The question being, how many of these agricultural centers under religious church front are doing experimentation? But the same Martin Bormann that was living on Colonial Dignidad, that is charged with hiring the assassins that killed John Kennedy, is a connecting link to Nazi experimentation in Chile at the present time, using that same property. And also, the Jonestown area was a place which, after the death, was revealed as a school for assassins, and suggested that trained assassins under mind control are now out at large, out in the world. And I think that these parallels can't be ignored and should be going into much, much further.
So, yeah, Gerhard Mertins was an official certified friend of Colonia Dignidad, which is about as dark as it gets, but once again, we aren't even close to done. So going on. During the late 60s and early 70s, Mertins also pursued deals in East Asia. U.S. Senate hearings in 1978 heard that the company provided price lists to a notorious South Korean businessman, Tongsun Park, who was accused of inappropriately buying influence in the U.S. Congress in the 1970s. In 2005, Park was also alleged to have been involved in the Iraq oil for food scandal. 2 years later, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison for his role in attempting to bribe UN officials at the behest of Saddam Hussein. In 1972, Mertins entered into a long-lasting relationship with the Chinese military parastatal Norinco, their arms manufacturer, a relationship that also involved Saddam Hussein. With deals stretching from South America to Asia, the late 1960s and early 70s were the quote salad days of Merex and Gerhard Mertins. But the good times didn't last. Mertins' cachet stemmed from his intelligence connections in Germany and then the US. In the early 1970s, he worked as an agent for the Field Activities Command, US AFAC, an Army-run espionage unit whose brief was to collect human intelligence, what people were doing and why, from around the world. Mertins frequently upset his handlers, often selling to countries that were considered, at the very least, anti-American. His relationship with U.S. intelligence ended in 1972 during the Vietnam War, after he had barged his way into U.S. military headquarters in Saigon, announced he was with American intelligence, and demanded to see the officer in charge. His bombast and indiscretion had gone too far. Mertins was dismissed as a U.S. AFAC operative. Refusing to accept his dismissal, Mertins took the unprecedented step of taking U.S. AFAC to court. The proceedings were declared classified, but because of the scare with Mertins, it was decided to disband the unit altogether. Mertins' star was also waning in Germany. The media, still outraged at his involvement in sales to Pakistan, intensified their coverage of the arms dealer after the district attorney decided to prosecute Merex for breaking German export laws and falsifying documents. Also accused with Mertins were his business partners, Günther Laurisch, a former Nazi parachutist who had served under Mertins, Karl von Brackel, a Luftwaffe member, and Heinz Hombrusch, an Austrian gunmaker who has also served as a Merex sales agent. The legal proceedings marked a slump in the company's profitability until the early 1980s. Indeed, after the trial concluded, quote, Mertins was a broken man, claiming he only contravened a few laws because his government had told him to. The once brash arms dealer appeared, quote, tired and tousled. His defense team claimed that his dealings in Pakistan were at the explicit behest of the German government. Mertins explained his relationship to the German intelligence network, BND, and the judge found little to discredit his evidence, especially after a BND operative testified that the government was almost always aware of what Mertins had done in Pakistan as part of a project codenamed Uranus. At the end of 1975, Mertins was eventually cleared of any technical wrongdoing in the Pakistan deals, even though he had provided weapons to both sides of the conflict in contravention of the law. But Mertins was nothing if not combative. Feeling that his name had been ruined by the trial, he took the German government to court, requesting financial relief. He did so partly out of pride, but primarily out of financial necessity. By 1977, Mertins was so strapped for cash that his estate in the Rhine was seized. Merex's financial statements from the time read like a disaster story. By 1980, the company had costs of 8.2 million Deutschmarks, but only 1 million Deutschmarks in holdings and a paltry 500,000 Deutschmarks in turnover. This second trial provided some relief for Mertins, who received 5 million Deutschmarks in compensation, although he had requested 12 million. The latter part of the 1970s was a fight for survival for Mertins, who became even less discriminating in his selection of customers. He was an example of blowback writ large. Well, we might question that later, the blowback aspect, but anyways, he was an example of blowback writ large working for both sides in the Cold War battle of ideologies. By the early 1980s, he had, remarkably, again ingratiated himself with U.S. intelligence structures, this time working with the CIA. He befriended James Atwood, an American with strong CIA links, who was regarded as an oddball small arms dealer. Atwood was a minor celebrity in neo-Nazi circles as a result of his book, The Daggers and Edged Swords of Hitler's Germany. By the mid-1980s, Atwood and Mertins shared office space in the U.S. and worked together on a deal in 1986 that supplied weapons to the Nicaraguan Contras as part of the Iran-Contra affair. So there we go, maybe not the biggest shocker in the world. Gerhard Mertins becomes an arms supplier to the Contras in the 80s. Feinstein goes on. Iran-Contra was the highly controversial and illegal arrangement whereby the Americans sold weapons to Iran, then run by the Islamic regime of Ayatollah Khomeini and subject to a U.S. arms embargo, and used the proceeds to fund right-wing Nicaraguan rebels, the Contras, who were fighting to overthrow the left-wing Sandinista government. It was a disastrous operation undertaken by Colonel Oliver North and conceived at the highest levels of the Reagan administration. Vice President George H.W. Bush played a leading role, along with his Saudi Arabian friend, Prince Bandar bin Sultan, the Israelis, and a host of unscrupulous arms dealers, in the debacle that ultimately armed the same Iran that is today regarded as the U.S. and Israel's most implacable foe. So yes, props to Feinstein there for acknowledging that President George H.W. Bush played a leading role in all of this. He wasn't just blissfully unaware. And neither was another big subject in this book, Shadow World, Prince Bandar bin Sultan. But we're not going to talk about him more until a little bit later. But going on about this Iran-Contra business, Merex's role in Iran-Contra was to sort out one of the many potentially embarrassing foul-ups in the affair. Oliver North's front company, Enterprise, had purchased $2.2 million of illicit arms from Monzer al-Qasar, a prominent and controversial arms dealer known as the Prince of Marbella, Spain, using money raised from selling arms to Iran. While the weapons were en route from communist Poland, of all places, where they had been purchased, to Portugal, U.S. authorities lifted the arms embargo on the Nicaraguan Contras, leaving Enterprise with a huge cache of overpriced weapons. To save face, Mertins and Atwood interceded on behalf of Enterprise and convinced the CIA to purchase the weapons. Helmut Mertins, the son of Gerhard, was duly sent to Portugal to clean up the mess. He contracted another ship and oversaw the transfer of the weapons to a CIA depot in the U.S. from where they were reportedly transferred on to the Contras. At much the same time as Mertins was working for the CIA to assist the Contras, he was also developing a relationship with China. As noted earlier, Merex had had contact with the Chinese military parastatal Norinco as early as 1972, providing it with invaluable access to Western arms and intelligence networks. As a confluence, Mertins was on good terms with the head of Norinco, Zhao Fei. Chinese authorities coveted a powerful and accurate 120mm cannon produced by the huge German conglomerate Rheinmetall. Mertins acquired the plans of the cannon and provided them to Norinco. Such are the morals of the arms dealer. Developed and nurtured by German intelligence as the arms dealer of choice for shadowy transactions, Mertins was willing, only a decade later, to undermine the military capacity of his fatherland so as to support communist China. Mertins' correspondence with Zhao Fei made clear that Merex had engaged in arms deals with China that flew in the face of U.S. policy despite his connections to American intelligence. The correspondence also revealed that Saddam Hussein was a potential Merex customer only 2 years before the Iran-Contra scandal in the middle of the Iran-Iraq War. In one throwaway line in a letter from Mertins to Zhao Fei, the German reported that, quote, "We have contacted Saddam Hussein and pointed out again the quality of Chinese military production." Mertins' relationship with Zhao Fei had become public as a result of another questionable transaction. In 1982, the U.S. company Fairchild Weston retained the services of Merex to help sell its products in China. One item in particular caught the attention of the Chinese, a long-range spy camera known as the LORAP. Norinco decided to buy 2 of the cameras at a price of $20 million. The U.S. Defense Department was concerned that the cameras would greatly enhance Chinese intelligence capacity. They suggested that, quote, "Due to technology involved, advance in intelligence gathering capability and resultant threat to U.S. allies, we would recommend denial." Reagan administration officials disagreed. The Pentagon was overruled and the Norinco deal given the green light. Mertins was nevertheless angry, believing that he had been sold short on his commission on the deal. Fairchild Weston objected, claiming that Mertins had been more of a hindrance than a help in the transaction. Mertins sued the company, with the Germans' claims overturned on appeal. The arms dealer would never see any money from the project. His double-dealing, constant deception, and lack of loyalty not only to a country or ideology, but even to his closest partners, were proving the undoing of Gerhard Mertins. But Merex would continue to prosper in the depths of the shadow world. Now, apologies for reading that entire chapter, but hopefully you can see why I did. Not only is Gerhard Mertins a celebrated war hero, Nazi paratrooper, not only did he foster intimate ties with the head of West German intelligence, General Reinhard Gehlen, who we've talked about before in several episodes in the past as a very influential and nefarious figure. in the history of the Cold War. Not only was he dear friends with Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, and did business with him in South America, not only was he a dear friend of the Nazi pedophile cult torture compound known as Colonia Dignidad in Chile, but he was also an important player in that scandal of scandals that we have discussed at so much length on this show, the Iran-Contras scandal. Now, I also want to clarify a couple small things with Feinstein's chapter there, because overall I think it's absolutely excellent work, and I recommend anybody to go and buy this book and read. It is incredibly dense, but the information in it is staggering, very well researched, etc. But I think there's a certain aspect of this book where I think we can intervene a little bit and maybe put a little bit of a different perspective on it, especially with everything that we've explored about Liberia so far and the propensity for certain powerful, invisible hands to manipulate events. And so you noticed a few times there in that chapter that Feinstein invokes the notion of blowback. And while I'm not 100% dismissive of this concept, I am somewhat critical with the way that it gets thrown around a lot, particularly in sort of left-wing analysis of deep political events. I think actually that, as far as I can tell, the CIA, via arms dealer Sam Cummings, supplying weapons to Fidel Castro in the late 1950s, before he took power and before he declared himself basically a communist, maybe that can be accurately classified as a form of blowback. Although I don't know how really monumental the U.S. arms shipments to Castro were during that guerrilla war. I guess we can probably presume that they helped somewhat, but were they decisive? I'm not so sure. There's also a little weird kind of synchronicity there. If anybody remembers way back to our episode about Che Guevara, we stumbled across a very weird little factoid, or really rumor, that the Granma boat that Fidel Castro and Che and the original insurgents used to sail to Cuba and start their insurrection was sold to them by Swedish Nazi industrialist and a Caribbean and Latin American resident at that time, Axel Wenner-Gren, who I think was deeply suspected of maintaining ties to this international post-war Nazi underground that Gerhard Mertins was absolutely a critical part of. And actually, since we're on the topic of Axel Wenner-Gren, just to double the synchronicity, I was slightly amused and disturbed reading through Jim Bishop's State Department testimony when he mentioned that at the outset of the Liberian Civil War, the Mount Nimba iron ore mine that we had talked about in the last episode was owned by a Swedish company called Electrolux. And if you remember back to when we discussed this in Contras 7, Electrolux was the big Swedish conglomerate founded by, who else? Axel Wenner-Gren. Now, to be fair, he had been dead for a couple decades by the time this war popped off. But it's an interesting synchronicity nonetheless. So in that case, maybe it's appropriate to use the word blowback, but I think later near the end of the chapter, when Feinstein talks about Mertins being sort of sociopathic and only out for his own personal gain, in a very classic arms dealer kind of way, and that even though there's all this evidence that he was a dyed-in-the-wool, lifelong Nazi who associated with other various notorious Nazi war criminals and supported political parties that were in Germany that aimed at sort of some kind of restoration of the Third Reich, that at a certain point in like the 70s or the 80s, he started doing business with communist countries, which meant that he was betraying his own side, doing these business deals with Zhao Fei and Norinco in China, for example, or getting these surplus weapons from communist Poland in the 80s to ship to the Contras, which is a thing that happened. Feinstein kind of reads that as, oh, well, he's willing to actually help out the Chinese communists, and he'll even stab his own Nazi side in the back. Now, I would quibble with that just a little bit. And the reason I would is, I think, if anybody goes back to our Contra episodes, most of them kind of touch on this, but I think particularly for this episode, the most relevant ones might be Contra 5, Victory, and Contra 6 about BCCI, which, as I've already mentioned, may actually include Gerhard Mertins as a character in it, under the pseudonym Heinrich. And the more I'm going back over this stuff and seeing all of his business dealings in Pakistan, that was a huge thing with Heinrich in the book, is that he had done a lot of business deals selling jets to Pakistan, which is exactly what Gerhard Mertins did. So one kind of thesis that we have throughout Contra, and this is really explored in Contra 5, when we sort of read from the horse's mouth, Reagan administration officials in the 90s bragging about the multifaceted, very full court press covert plan to subvert the Soviet Union and bring about the destruction of the Eastern Bloc and communism in Europe and Russia, essentially, under the direction of the true crusader, Bill Casey. And one component that stuck out to us as odd in that Peter Schweizer book, Victory, was it described how when Reagan came into office, CIA Director Casey flew to China secretly, and he met with the head of Chinese intelligence, and they had a big dinner, and they got drunk together, and Bill Casey allegedly pitched them on a project to help supply weapons and other supplies to the Afghan Mujahideen, who were then fighting the Soviets. And because of the Sino-Soviet split and the border disputes and the sort of official beef between the USSR and China at that point, the head of Chinese intelligence signed off on it, and they did assist. So just because a Nazi German arms dealer is doing business with China in the 1970s and the 1980s, and this sounds like particularly, though I think it started in 1972 when Mao was still alive, but it sounds like it really kicked up in the 80s when Deng Xiaoping had taken over and China had established relations with the United States economically and to some extent politically, and there was the secret CIA relationship going on with China. So I don't necessarily see Gerhard Mertins palling around with the Chinese as a sign that he had given up or turned his back on or was betraying his Nazi ideology. No, I think, in fact, what's more likely is that he was a part of a much bigger plan, the culmination of his life's work, you could say. And you can even see that in his big transaction during the Iran-Contra scandal, where he was involved in getting weapons from the People's Republic of Poland in 1986, which was still very much communist, though it was about to no longer be. And, that alone would seem like you're doing business with commies. And of course, I think Poland was so desperate for hard currency by 1986, and they were really getting caught on the very bad end of a lot of IMF loans that they had taken on in the 70s, I think rather foolishly, and the screws were tightening very consciously from the perspective of the Reagan administration cowboys. So, it's understandable why they would sell to somebody like Mertins at that point, and it's understandable why Mertins would go buy from a communist country. So, I think there's a distinction to be made against, an arms dealer can buy or sell from anybody regardless of their ideology or how much of a sicko or a murderer or freak they are. But it's all a means to a greater end, and I don't believe, even though Mertins by all accounts, was a very corrupt and shady businessman who screwed people over constantly and kind of embezzled money and was very petty and all these things. And so I do believe he was probably a greedy man, but isn't greed a certain component of Nazism to begin with? The greed for Lebensraum and an empire, a Reich, just straight up stealing the entire resources of entire countries around you, a kind of hyper-colonialization accelerated by genocide. I think there's a lot of greed that cuts to the heart of the Nazi ideology, and I think that's also why a lot of these Nazis took what some could say is the cowardly path at the end of the war, and they scrambled like rats off of a sinking ship into the arms of U.S. intelligence. It doesn't mean, though, that they actually gave up being Nazis. Some of them had to pretend not to be anymore, like, say, Wernher von Braun, because he was a public figure in the United States, very important in the Apollo program, etc. But, people like Klaus Barbie, Quandt, Gerhard Mertins, Otto Skorzeny, no, I think these guys still had one great enemy that they wanted to slay in their lifetime, and that was communism, specifically Russian communism, the Soviet Union, the country that vanquished them at the end of World War II. From their perspective, a nation of Untermenschen, of Slavs and Jews and Central Asians, etc., that were absolutely inferior to the great Aryan German race, but nonetheless utterly conquered them. So I think if you look at the career of Gerhard Mertins, even up through the late 80s, despite who some of his individual business contacts were, I don't think he ever gave up this dream. And as much as I hate to admit it, he was lucky enough to live long enough to see his dream come true at the end of the 1980s with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the capitalist reintegration of East Germany, and the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But now I've been reading about this Nazi, Gerhard Mertins, for about an hour. You might be wondering, well, okay, he's been involved in dozens of nefarious plots and activities around the entire world during the Cold War. But what about Liberia? What the hell does this guy have to do with Liberia? Well, let's jump ahead to Chapter 4 in Shadow World, In Defense of Humanity, and find out. And in this chapter, we're also going to be introduced to some of Gerhard Mertins' newer business associates in the 1980s and going into the early 90s. And every one of these people is very important to put up on our grand interlock chart for what will unfurl throughout the rest of the 1990s in Liberia. Because, spoiler alert, Gerhard Mertins dies in 1993, before Charles Taylor ever becomes president. But Merex, on the other hand, very much lives on in the shadow world. Also pay attention in this chapter to the way that Feinstein describes the way the arms industry changed after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the new types of conflicts that sprung up around the world. Because even though he doesn't identify it or classify it as such, I think it lends some credence to my developing theory of anarcho-colonialism. So, Feinstein writes in Chapter 4, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 led to a major change in the way arms dealers did business around the world. Rather than reflecting, quote, an end to history and thus conflict, as the U.S. model of market-led democracy was embraced globally, the post-Cold War world was racked by ever more complex armed conflicts. The collapse of the support that had sustained many of the world's less stable regimes on the basis of their affiliation to the US or the Soviets prefigured a massive outbreak in conflict between ethnic, intrastate, and non-state actors. Disparate groups emerged within countries or without any national affiliation in the case of religious extremism, seeking power or to cause maximum disruption for a diversity of reasons: the promise of ethnic utopia, economic advantage, or religious expression. For the smaller arms dealers operating in the shadows, these new clients were fertile ground. Merex, for one, was quickly able to move into these new markets, taking advantage of the explosion of civil wars and ethnic conflicts across a number of continents. The company expanded its reach exponentially, running a raft of notorious sales agents, including the likes of the Liberian brothers Charles and Bob Taylor. So there you go. Charles Taylor and his brother were working for Merex as sales agents in Africa. Going on, Merex profited from some of the most notorious conflicts of the next decade and a half, including the civil wars in Yugoslavia and Liberia and Sierra Leone, and the U.S. invasion of Iraq. In so doing, Merex was connected into a vast international network of arms dealers, revolutionaries, despots, charlatans, warmongers, religious extremists, torturers, sanctions busters, money launderers, shady intelligence operatives, and opportunistic entrepreneurs, all of them operating wherever there was enough chaos to turn a profit. This anarchic labyrinth was the shadow world in the new global reality. In 1990, Merex restructured to deal with legal and financial difficulties and to prepare for a profitable existence in the new world. In a significant move, Joe der Hovsepian was brought in as a partner. And this guy is very shadowy and very important, so pay attention. A self-proclaimed, quote, citizen of the globe, der Hovsepian is of Armenian and Lebanese origin, with strong links to Germany, Italy, Switzerland, and France. I met him in Amman, Jordan in May 2010. His office on Mecca Street, all glass and dark wood, is decorated with posters of guns and other weaponry. Der Hovsepian is an imposing man. His craggy face reflects his cosmopolitan origins, Teutonic and Middle Eastern features, a trim Germanic mustache below a bulbous red nose. The large black Stetson and cowboy boots make him appear even taller than he is. Garrulous, charming, sometimes brusque, Der Hovsepian described his early career. The son of a legionnaire father and a Lebanese mother, he had traveled the globe, always in military circles. Following his father's military instincts, he joined the Lebanese army, where he trained as a fighter pilot, including at bases in the U.S. His own adventurous spirit and marital ties to one of Lebanon's preeminent families saw the young Joe quickly attain the rank of colonel, an appellation by which he is to become known in arms-dealing circles. By 1978, Der Hovsepian had left the Lebanese armed forces and opened a rifle and sports shooting store in Bonn, the hometown of the former Nazi and Merex founder, Gerhard Mertins. And by the early 80s, he had started to work with Mertins as an arms dealer. Der Hovsepian was initially vague about the work he and Merex undertook for much of the 1980s, but it was clear that he was often in the loop about what Mertins was up to, not least because the two lived on the same property. Mertins had used his considerable windfall from his trial against the German intelligence agency, the BND, to purchase a massive chicken farm and estate in Thomasburg, a district of Königswinter across the Rhine from Bonn. Der Hovsepian suggested that Mertins had used his substantial government connections to increase the value of his property by persuading the German Department of Foreign Affairs, for whom his niece's husband worked, to build an office complex on a plot next to his. As Mertins was often cash-strapped during the 80s, he sometimes paid those who undertook work for him with small slices of land from the Thomasburg estate. Der Hovsepian was one such recipient, living on the property along with Mertins and a hodgepodge of contacts that the German had developed. Der Hovsepian now claims that Mertins swindled him out of nearly $3 million. Instead of paying Der Hovsepian for services rendered, Mertins offered him a prime piece of the Thomasburg estate for redevelopment. When developed, it was assumed its value would skyrocket. There was only problem that Mertins kept to himself. Planning regulations specifically forbade any building on Der Hovsepian's newly acquired land. This was one of a litany of instances in which der Hovsepian claims Mertins cheated him out of money. When der Hovsepian became a partner in Merex in 1990, the company was floundering. Financial reports from the time suggest a rapid increase in costs amid falling income, a downswing in fortunes that almost eradicated the gains of its halcyon days. For salvation, Mertins turned to a longtime partner, Saudi Arabia. The Saudis were looking to purchase Leopard tanks, known as Leos, from Germany. Mertins, with his government connections, was willing to undertake the deal, for which Saudi Arabia agreed to pay him 16 to 17 million Deutschmarks, enough to stave off bankruptcy. The Thomasburg property was raised as collateral against the cash advance. This unusual arrangement was negotiated by Mertins' friend, Prince Turki al-Faisal, brother of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, brother-in-law of Prince Bandar, son of the late King Faisal, and at the time of the deal, director of the Al-Mukhabarat, the Saudi intelligence agency. The contracts were therefore signed in the name of Turkey's assistant, Ahmed Badeeb, and Gerhard Mertins. Mertins' key government contact on the deal was a controversial Bavarian politician and former defense minister, Franz Josef Strauss. Embroiled in the Lockheed bribery scandals of the early 60s, among others, Strauss was described by Joe as, quote, very corrupt, perhaps explaining his willingness to engage with Mertins and Merex. However, the Bavarian leader died unexpectedly while out hunting in 1988, so Mertins was unable to deliver the Leos for which he had already been paid. Refusing to return the money and unable to supply the tanks, Mertins had only one option: to close down the company and reopen a new incarnation. The restructuring of Merex was also motivated by Mertins' advanced age. He would die in 1993, so the new company, named Deutsche Merex, was structured to reflect Mertins' declining role. After some horse trading, in 1992, the new company's ownership was split equally between der Hovsepian and Mertins' sons Helmut and Jorg Thomas, known as JT. 1% of the company remained in the hands of the U.S. Merex Corp, which at the time was still headed by Gerhard Mertins. Other parts of the Merex network mutated into bizarre forms. One, Merex AG, was cannibalized into a company running a hotel and sports center in Gut Buschhof, a suburb of Königswinter, suggesting that some members of the Mertins clan may have been seeking a line of work less stressful than arms dealing. Soon after Gut Buschhof was formed, and after Mertins' death in 1993, Thomasburg Hotel und Sportanlagen was established to run the center. Officially, the director of the company was Ahmed Badeeb, Prince Turki's assistant. Now here's a little information about Ahmed Badeeb that, once again, you think this is all shady as fuck, but it's about to get so much shadier. He goes on. Deeply embedded in Saudi Arabian intelligence services, Badeeb had a relatively unremarkable career until the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s. As a biology teacher working under the Saudi Ministry of Education, Badeeb's most famous pupil was Osama bin Laden. Badeeb befriended his student, whose family was from the same area of Yemen as his own. He rose through the ranks of the Saudi civil service and was, by his mid-30s, chief of staff to Prince Turki al-Faisal. The assassination of Prince Turki's father, King Faisal, by his half-brother's son, didn't affect Turkey's upward trajectory, which culminated in his appointment as the head of the Al-Mukhabarat, a post he held for the next 2 decades. He was the ambassador to the United Kingdom from 2003 to 2005, before briefly being made Saudi ambassador to the US to replace Prince Bandar, a post he held from July 2005 to December 2006. Badeeb, in his role as right-hand man to one of the most powerful intelligence figures in the Desert Kingdom, was often sent to mediate with important intelligence allies, arranging arms deals and cash drop-offs. In one deal, Badeeb traveled to Pakistan, where he met with the military ruler, President Zia. Sent by Prince Turki with a considerable amount of cash, Badeeb informed his Pakistani host that Saudi Arabia was willing to fund the purchase of a range of high-precision rockets from Chinese suppliers. His handlers, scarcely believing the offer, pried open Badeeb's suitcase to confirm the generous bounty while he was speaking with President Zia. Badeeb was also active in Afghanistan, shepherding the relationship between his homeland and the Mujahideen fighters. It is assumed that Badeeb took ownership of the Thomasburg estate in lieu of the money owed to the Saudis for Mertins' failed Leo contract. So I just want to note right there, first of all, I was reading straight from the text, but I think there is a slight typo. The individual's name is actually Prince Turki bin Faisal al Saud. He's the son of King Faisal. So yeah, Prince Turki bin Faisal is who we're talking about here, who was the head of Saudi intelligence for many, many years, including right up through 9/11. His assistant, Ahmed Badeeb, was a high school teacher and basically friend of Osama bin Laden, who did extensive work on the entire Afghanistan Mujahideen operation throughout the 1980s. And then in the early 90s, after this failed Leopard tank deal, he ends up taking over part of Gerhard Mertins' estate in Germany. So these Nazis are in business with some of the shadiest elements of the Saudi royal family and the Saudi intelligence services. And while Prince Bandar, who will also kind of pop in and out of this story, he was mentioned, is usually held up as the Saudi official or the Saudi royal with incredibly close personal ties to the United States and the U.S. elites, particularly the Bush family, who used to call him Bandar Bush. Prince Turki bin Faisal also has incredibly close ties to the United States and the elites. In fact, I believe Prince Turki attended the very elite Lawrenceville School, which is a prep school in New Jersey, which I think at the time was the most expensive prep school in the United States. So he, similar to Bandar, who I think was educated at another prep school, got an American education, obviously spoke English fluently, and had many, many contacts with high-level political figures and business figures, and most assuredly was one of the point people collaborating with Bill Casey throughout Operation Cyclone in Afghanistan in the early 80s, which was a massive multi-billion-dollar operation. You also see there that he sent his assistant to Pakistan to talk to President Zia with a big duffel bag full of cash to basically arrange for the Pakistanis to purchase with Saudi money advanced Chinese rockets. So there we go again with the kind of curious Chinese connection collaborating with these very right-wing anti-Soviet forces in the 80s. But going on, Feinstein writes, while it may have seemed strange to retain the Merex name given the company's difficulties, in some ways Deutsche Merex had cachet. According to der Hovsepian, the German and neo-Nazi connections won over Arab customers, some of whom believed that, quote, if Hitler had finished off the Jews, they wouldn't have all the problems they have today with Israel. Der Hovsepian didn't shrink from capitalizing on this tortured logic, greeting Arab clients with a nonchalant, Walaikum salam, wie geht's dir? This may be the gimmick he alludes to when suggesting that, quote, to be successful in arms dealing, you need a good gimmick, good quality equipment, and you must not cheat a client. As important, and part of the reason so many dealers are gregarious, larger-than-life characters, is an ability to foster close relationships with those in power, something der Hovsepian has done with aplomb in Saudi Arabia, where the new Merex secured its first major deal. In August 1990, Saddam Hussein, fresh from his bruising decade-long conflict with Iran, launched an invasion of Kuwait. The Saudis were deeply worried, especially at the prospective use of biological and chemical weapons by Saddam. Merex was approached to arrange the purchase of 1 million gas masks. For such a massive deal, der Hovsepian required discreet assistance, so he recalled the Mertins brothers from the U.S. After patching together multiple suppliers, der Hovsepian was able to secure the consignment, personally flying the gas masks into Saudi Arabia. It was a lucrative contract, by der Hovsepian's own account worth $126 million. As further reward for his rapid delivery, the arms dealer was awarded an official citation from the Saudi government. Der Hovsepian was nevertheless scathing about the, quote, special costs of doing business with the Saudis. Using a glass on his desk, he described the process to me. Quote, "They're very greedy. You always have to pay bribes. If they want to buy this glass, you tell them it's $5. They will beat you down to $1. Then they will say, okay, I will give you $3, but you give me $2 back." Der Hovsepian claims that on his Saudi deals, he has to give more than half of the contract price back in bribes. The local Saudi embassy military attaché always signs the receipts. Quote, "Money is paid to them in Germany, and the kickback is transferred to the local military attaché, and he transfers it to the princes." He concluded, not a piece of equipment would go from the U.S. to Saudi without Bandar getting a commission. Now, before we go any further into this chapter of Shadow World, I want to pause for a second and pivot to what I think is the only other English language book to profile Gerhard Mertins. And this is one that I found relatively recently when I was doing the research for this exact chapter. And this book is called Private Warriors by Ken Silverstein, which I think was published by, surprisingly, Verso Books in 2000. And Ken Silverstein, I think, was a writer for Harper's, The Nation, and Mother Jones, and I first found a series of articles that he had written in the late 90s about Gerhard Mertins and another German arms dealer who's a little bit younger than Mertins, but also played a very prominent role in the arms-dealing underworld, Iran-Contra, and other things, a man named Ernst Werner Glatt. Glatt does not directly interface with Liberia or West Africa, as far as I've been able to discern, but he's essentially a part of the same world as Gerhard Mertins. So this book, much like Shadow World, is an investigative expose on the global arms industry and private military contractors from the Cold War through the 1990s. Now, this book was published in 2000, so somewhat like The Mask of Anarchy, we don't have full historical hindsight, basically, and it doesn't really matter anyways, because this book actually, I don't think, mentions Liberia a single time, and definitely does not talk about Charles Taylor or Gerhard Mertins' connections to Charles Taylor, which is almost surprising because it does a very good job tracing the tentacles of the Gehlen Org and the Merex network. And in fact, I think this book must have been a kind of foundational source or jumping off point for Feinstein's Shadow World. So in his chapter on Mertins, I just want to read a few small things, because he actually gets to interview a few of these people that knew Mertins, including Gerhard Bauch. So Silverstein covers many of the same beats that we just talked about, particularly Otto Skorzeny with a practical boatload of CIA money going to Egypt and training Gamal Abdel Nasser's forces, a project which Gerhard Mertins and his comrades would be heavily involved in. He talks about, in the mid-1960s, how Gerhard Mertins became a business partner of American arms dealer Sam Cummings and his business partner, the German Ernst Werner Glatt, when they both hired Merex as their purchasing agent in Germany for Interarms. Of course, then they did have a falling out at some point, but more on Sam Cummings in a second, because this book had something very interesting about him. So Silverstein writes, I spoke to a number of major Cold War-era arms dealers, and all were well acquainted with Mertins. Arif Durrani, a Pakistani arms dealer, moved to the U.S. in the early 70s and set up shop in Spring Valley, New York. he and a partner had a contract to supply spare parts for the Pakistani Air Force's F-86 planes, the ones Merex had supplied back in 1966. Mertins, meanwhile, was supplying F-86 spares to the apartheid government in South Africa. I bought truckloads and trainloads of spares from Canada, Durrani recalls. Mertins was buying them from me until I left Spring Valley in 1979. According to Durrani, Mertins had substantial business of his own in Pakistan, where he retained as his agent an important general. Now that's interesting right there. I've already brought up what we talked about in Contra 6 about BCCI, and Arif Durrani was one of the very few people that actually went to prison and was convicted in the U.S. for basically illegally exporting military parts to Iran. And I could not help but be shocked when we were doing that exploration into BCCI. In that one book, Outlaw Bank, it mentioned that at the time of his arrest in 1986, Arif Durrani was the chief principal in a California company called Merex Corp. So naturally I thought, this cannot be a mere coincidence. Now, even though the American subsidiary of Merex was based in Maryland on the East Coast, what are the odds that a totally different Pakistani arms dealer has a company called Merex out in California that primarily is supplying military equipment to the Israelis? And then on top of that, what are the odds that one of the main sources of this book, Outlaw Bank, is a mysterious High German arms dealer who goes by the name Heinrich? And even though details in this book about Heinrich are a little bit murky, he basically comes forward to these journalists who are working for Time magazine and tells them an incredibly salacious story about the criminal underworld of BCCI, but in particular, what Heinrich wants to tell these people is that the head of BCCI, Aga Hassan Abadi, has secretly been brokering very sensitive top-secret military and surveillance technology to the Soviets. And he comes to them, I think, in the twilight days of the Cold War. And he flies over from Europe and he meets with Beatty and these other journalists at Time. And this character, Heinrich, is described as basically dealing in heavy, expensive weaponry, things like fighter jets, particularly around the Third World, and even more particularly to Pakistan. Now, as we've already gone over, Gerhard Mertins did a hell of a lot of work in Pakistan. He was involved in some of these Iran-Contra weapons transfers. In fact, I think the one in 1986 involves weapons that are procured from Poland. And in the book Outlaw Bank, Heinrich mentions that he has good contacts in Warsaw. Now, given all that, you think we might have our man here, this mysterious whistleblower, coming forth to tank BCCI for his own mysterious purposes. But this book here, Private Warriors, actually says a little bit more about Arif Durrani, and he sort of clears up this confusion around the name Merex. So continuing with Silverstein here, he writes that following Mertins' firing by the Army, I think in the late 70s, which we talked about earlier, the CIA picked up Mertins as an asset. That allowed him to get a piece of the pie from the Reagan-funded programs in support of anti-communist guerrilla movements. The CIA is always looking for guys who can get small arms, and Mertins was perfect, says a former U.S. military official. Quote, he supplied weapons for a variety of groups. Among them, says this and several other sources, including Arif Durrani, who did substantial business with Mertins in the 1980s, were the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and the Contras in Nicaragua. In the case of the latter, I found evidence of Mertins' involvement in the files of Judge Lawrence Walsh, the independent counsel in the Iran-Contra affair. One of Mertins' partners on the deal in question was his great friend, Colonel James Atwood, an eccentric Georgian who served at one time or another in the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps. Atwood, who died in 1977 and is buried at Arlington, served with U.S. forces who reached Berlin as Hitler committed suicide and the Nazi regime collapsed. He married a German woman and seems to have become obsessed with all things German, especially the Third Reich. As told by John Berendt, author of Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, which takes place in Atwood's hometown of Savannah, and in which he is a minor character, Atwood bought 60 German arms factories together with their stocks of abandoned Nazi weapons at the end of the war. He later wrote a book called The Daggers and Edged Weapons of Hitler's Germany, which made him something of a cult figure in certain neo-Nazi circles. I once went with him to a World War II paraphernalia show in Baltimore, and when the convention hall found out he was there, business just stopped, says a former CIA man who knew Atwood well. Quote, "They rearranged everything so he could speak to the crowd." Atwood owned Hitler's personal silverware, heavy oversized pieces with AH engraved in a slender sans serif, writes Barron, and according to the CIA officer, a large collection of porcelain figurines made in the concentration camps. From his base in Savannah, Atwood traveled the world buying and selling everything from sports cars to water chestnuts to arms, which he peddled to personal collectors as well as government clients, including the U.S. He had plenty of friends at the CIA, where he curried favor by presenting procurement officers with gifts such as buckets of shrimp, watches, and chrome-barreled Chinese assault rifles. In September 1986, Atwood and Mertins helped work a deal involving weapons for the Nicaraguan Contras. And we touched on this before, but I'll just read it again. Oliver North's enterprise had used $2.2 million in proceeds from secret sales to Iran to buy from Poland 27 containers of mines, grenades, assault rifles, mortars, and plastic explosives. The enterprise intended to resell the weapons, purchased with the help of Mansour al-Qassar, an arms dealer, suspected drug kingpin, and known associate of the terrorist Abu Nidal, architect of the 1985 Christmas massacres in Rome and Vienna, among other notorious attacks, to the Nicaraguan rebels. The Area, a Danish freighter chartered by the enterprise, picked up the weapons in Poland and set sail for Portugal to pick up additional cargo. From there, it would deliver its treasure to Contra camps in Honduras. As the deal was unfolding, Congress lifted the ban on military aid to the Contras, who no longer wanted the area's overpriced cargo. That left the enterprise stuck with a boatload of weapons and no buyer. At this point, Mertins and Atwood stepped in on the enterprise's behalf and convinced the CIA to buy the weapons. Helmut Mertins, Gerhard's son, and an officer of overseas trading and consulting, the Merex shell company that handled the deal, was dispatched to Portugal and arranged to have the area sail to Cherbourg. There, the weapons were transferred to another ship, the Iceland Saga, which in October 1986 docked at a CIA depot at Sunny Point, North Carolina. Later still, the agency apparently sent the weapons on to the Contras. The final destination of the weapons is not known for certain because much about the deal remains classified, including Atwood's lengthy interview with congressional investigators. FBI agents tried to depose Gerhard Mertins, but could never find him at his home. They did interview Helmut Mertins, whose deposition is the source for part of the information above. Helmut was never charged, but as a precaution, he retained the attorney Plato Caceres, whose clients over the years have included Oliver North's secretary, Fawn Hall, Soviet spy Aldrich Ames, and Monica Lewinsky. Now this is a little factoid that I think is very interesting in light of what we talked about last time in Demon Forces 4 with the operations in Chad. Silverstein writes that a number of sources, among them arms dealers and former intelligence officials, told me that Mertins was also a CIA supplier to the Secret Foreign Materiel Acquisition FMA program. He is said to have had good contacts in a variety of Eastern European countries, including the former Yugoslavia, Romania, and Bulgaria. Heinz Baumann, the Viennese arms dealer, says Mertins' purchases for the CIA included anti-personnel carriers that came from Romania and T-72 tank rounds bought from Bulgaria. Mertins had the tank rounds delivered to the airport in Frankfurt, where they were transferred to the U.S. Air Force base operating at the same site. Mertins was active in the arms trade until he died in March 1993, felled by a heart attack during a trip to Florida. His legacy, however, lived on. Helmut Mertins took up the Merex banner for a time and later founded a firm called United International Supplies Incorporated. An internet listing says the company's product line includes, in addition to office supplies, automobiles, and boats, police and military equipment such as body armor, riot control gear, firearms, ammunition, night vision equipment, and spare parts. Now here, we get back to the Durrani mystery. He writes that during the 1980s, Arif Durrani formed an American company called Merex. He told me that he had no formal connection to Mertins, but picked the name to take advantage of the instant recognition it provided within arms business circles. In 1987, Durrani was sentenced to a 10-year jail term for selling anti-aircraft missile parts to Iran. Durrani was released after serving half his term and now lives in Mexico. In 1988, federal agents raided Signal Aerospace, a Ventura, California company they charged with selling counterfeit jet parts to banned countries. Signal's president is Suzanne Stair, Durrani's wife, who authorities claim is simply a front for her husband. In regard to Iran, Durrani claims, with a fair amount of evidence to back him, that he was merely an agent for the Reagan administration, which at precisely the same time was secretly supplying the Ayatollah's regime. He dismisses the Ventura raid as a case of government harassment. And of course he does note here, remember this is just 2000, but another of Mertins' spawns is Joseph Hovsepian. It's sort of transliterated differently here. We're in a Khashoggi kind of dilemma, right? A former military officer in Lebanon, and Merex's longtime agent in that country. Hovsepian moved to Germany in the late 1980s and became partners with Mertins in a new company called Merex, which sold arms and industrial equipment. That Merex went out of business after Mertins' death, but as this book goes to press, in 2000, Hovsepian is under investigation, according to German sources, for arms deals he allegedly made in South Africa during the apartheid years. Now, for the remainder of this episode here, I'm going to put aside Private Warriors and Shadow World, and we are going to hold off talking about the rest of the Merex-Liberia relationship until the next 2 episodes. But the more I've dug into this in the last few days, and yes, I am recording this the night before I'm going to release it, because I just kept finding things, and I just had to scratch that itch of, was Gerhard Mertins the mysterious Heinrich in the book Outlaw Bank? I think so far I've laid out some clues there that would suggest that perhaps he is. His self-described relationships, doing major arms deals with Pakistan, of course his, quote, high German nationality, his mysterious resume, all suggest that Gerhard Mertins is probably one of a handful of Germans that would have been this source. And even though, as I was researching this, I couldn't quite even articulate to myself what the significance of it would be if Gerhard Mertins is Heinrich, I felt like it was a necessary thing to either pin down or debunk. So just to be safe, I went back this morning and I read all 400-odd pages of Jonathan Beatty and Sam Gwynn's Outlaw Bank book from 1993. And I have to say I'm very glad I did, because I have to confess that when Khaled and I recorded Contra 6 last year about the BCCI scandal, we split up our reading. I read another book about BCCI called False Prophets, which is very informative and has some relevant information for us today. But the Outlaw Bank book that Khaled mostly read, That is where the real gold is in regards to this mention of Merex Corp in California. On top of that, that book is a much more personal narrative, almost an oral history, if you will, even though it's written in the third person, referring to the journalists who wrote the book as Beatty and Gwynn. But that aside, it talks basically about how these two Time magazine journalists stumbled upon, in the early winter of 1991, this whole BCCI story, which they had no idea about before. A source named Jack Blum came to Jonathan Beatty and told him that he should look into BCCI. And Blum had been serving on the Kerry Commission in the late 1980s, which had to do with Iran-Contra and also got a little bit into money laundering, drug trafficking, etc. And this source of Beatty's, Blum, believed that thanks to the connivance of certain powerful political figures in Washington, he had been sort of boxed out of the Kerry Committee staff and prevented from digging deeper into this alluring case of this mysterious Pakistani bank, BCCI. And eventually in the book, he reveals who he thinks was the prime mover behind getting him out. And it was actually Senator Claiborne Pell from Rhode Island, who I think weirdly enough has come up in some of our either UFO episodes or adjacent to that, because Claiborne Pell, in addition to being a very highly esteemed Yankee, truly from that elite New England class, he, like many of his Yankee compatriots, was obsessed with UFOs in the 1980s and 1990s, which is its own offshoot into weird territory. But so this book, Outlaw Bank, is very much a play-by-play of the journalist's experience over the course of about 6 months, researching these stories, talking with various sources, and the kind of surreal, over-the-top kind of situations they get in with people that are coming and trying to tell them dirt about BCCI. There's a Palestinian individual named Asaf Ali who was closely connected to the monarch and leader of the United Arab Emirates, who had put up a lot of the early capital for BCCI. He starts to tell this very wild story early on in the book, where he talks about being recruited into what he calls the Black Network, which was, I guess you could say, a sort of intelligence network either affiliated with or part of BCCI that engaged in all kinds of, well, black operations, or what some people might call wet work, blackmail, assassination, things of that nature. And the narrative of this book actually starts later than I thought it had. It starts in February 1991, which drops us right in the middle of the historical period we're talking about. 1991 is when Merex is in business with Charles Taylor and the war is going on. So, according to this book, it isn't until around July of 1991 where Time journalist Jonathan Beatty is reached out to by the mysterious high German arms dealer known as Heinrich, who actually flies from Europe to the United States and stays at a motel near Beatty's home in Hermosa Beach, that classic Pinchonian redoubt, and has a series of interviews with him. Now that jumped out at me because that is both very late in the history of BCCI. In July 5th, 1991, BCCI would be raided by multiple regulatory agencies in multiple countries at the same time. Basically, the jig was just about up. But after the first few Time articles that were written by Jonathan Beatty and Sam Gwynn came out, and a big one came out in July, That's when Heinrich approaches them. Now, the book is somewhat circumspect in terms of giving away too many details. And in fact, the authors mention at another point that to protect their sources sometimes in writing their articles, they would make up certain details that were incorrect to throw potential bad guys off the scent of who their source actually was. And according to the authors in the book, after they put out their first couple articles, Heinrich was rather impressed that he could see the information he had given them sort of laundered into the piece, but really couldn't tie it back to him at all, which led him to cooperate with them more. But one very weird thing about Heinrich that we didn't even get to really talk about that much in Contra 6 was, like I said earlier, he comes to them, and it seems that his chief concern, or his chief angle that he's trying to push, is that the BCCI head, Aga Hassan Abadi, had actually been, throughout the 80s, giving highly sensitive top-secret U.S. military technology to the Soviets. And Heinrich, I guess, out of the goodness of his heart, wanted to make Americans aware of this scandalous and potentially treasonous development, and moreover wanted to make them aware of how much of a dangerous snake Aga Hassan Abadi was. For those who listened to that episode, you may remember Heinrich talking about how he believed that there was something evil, almost demonic, about Aga Hassan Abadi, and that one time he saw him walk out of a room, and then the door slammed shut behind him, almost like he was using some kind of psychic power to do it. Very strange. I have no idea what to make of that. But I think it's safe to say that Heinrich was really trying to sell a certain type of narrative. But the most interesting thing, and this is going to start spiraling us off into a few different weird directions, is he specifically claims that Abadi gave the Soviets the classified blueprints for the American Navstar system, or as you and I would refer to it today, GPS. This was a technology that was sort of being built out and developing very rapidly in the 1980s. In fact, one of the catalyzing events for its advancement was something that we talked about a lot in the last few episodes on the show, which is suspicious plane crashes involving American politicians. If you recall, there was the Korean Airlines Flight 007, which strayed several hundred miles into Soviet airspace off the coast of East Asia and was shot down by the Soviets, and happened to have huge John Birch Society bigwig Larry McDonald, congressman from Georgia, on board. So he and several hundred other people died. After that, Ronald Reagan was persuaded to start sharing Navstar data with other countries around the world to prevent such misunderstandings and incidents. But, of course, at the same time, I guess there was a kind of filter put on the bands so that regular civilians or foreign militaries could only basically use it with a certain imprecise range, I think between, let's say, 1,000 feet, whereas the U.S. military could basically pin it down to, a golf ball on the ground. It was very, very accurate, but that wasn't given out to the public or the international community, and that was heavily guarded information by the Americans. So when Heinrich tells them, no, Abadi gave them these documents, that's kind of a big bombshell. But what's even crazier is he says, I know because I've been inside of the offices of the Soviet Space Agency, and I've seen the documents, and I even know what safe they're in. So this blows away Beatty, and before long, Heinrich is offering to go back to the USSR, go into the office. He intimates that his access is so good that he could totally be left alone And he's watched people open the safe so many times that he's memorized the combination. And that if you give him a camera, he'll go and do it right away. He'll go tomorrow. Just make sure, you can get him the right equipment and buy him a plane ticket, whatever. And Beatty is so kind of shocked by this that he agrees to do it. And according to this book, this actually happens. And it actually happens in August of 1991, just days before there's a failed coup where the military tries to overthrow Gorbachev and reverse some of the reforms of perestroika and glasnost, because I think at this point many of these generals saw the writing on the wall that the Soviet Union was not long for this world if they kept going down Gorbachev's path. So Heinrich basically says, yeah, I'll go there. In fact, I think that he says he has a meeting in London, which he can't miss, but after that, he'll fly to Warsaw. There we go once again. Very strong Polish connections. And since this is August 1991, communism has fallen, and I believe Lech Wałęsa, the Solidarity leader, is the president of Poland, and they have a new government, everything. So Heinrich is going to go there, and then he says, have somebody bring me a camera and show me how to use it, and I'll do it. So Beatty does that. He gets a freelance journalist to bring him a camera. He goes, and I think a day or two later, he comes back and says, all right, I got it. And they manage to get these photos back to New York, and they look at them, and, well, they're not 100% confirmed to be top secret versions of these documents. He did photograph, inside of a Soviet office, all of the manuals for these GPS satellite systems, and then even snapped a few pictures in Red Square of a bunch of Red Army soldiers in a truck, like waving and laughing at him, which certainly takes a lot of guts when he had film on his camera that could have gotten him shot. So that adds an extra layer of weirdness to this whole Heinrich character. He's not merely just telling them a story and quote-unquote whistleblowing about BCCI and telling everybody about the nefarious pro-Soviet activities of Aga Hassan Abadi, but he's basically volunteering to go on an espionage mission and bring back proof to show that he's not bluffing, he's not making this up, and for some reason he has good enough access within the Soviet Space Agency, this German arms dealer, that he can sort of waltz right in, bring a camera with him, be left alone in rooms with sensitive information, and so on, which would seem to be a very dangerous thing to do. Even coming to these journalists is dangerous, but this especially. And then later on in the book, it mentions that at the end of August, after the failed coup, Heinrich was very stressed out because now either a lot of his contacts, it's not clear if they were a part of the coup or if they were against the coup, but he said that it caused a lot of problems for him and that people don't trust him and that basically he can't go back and kind of waltz in there again. The things have changed. But it did make me think about a number of things in relation to Liberia. And as it turns out, there are some very strange synchronicities with all of this, because as I've alluded to before, I think in Demon Forces 4, talking about Herman Cohen's testimony about the very valuable and top secret military installations that the U.S. had in Liberia, namely, there was a CIA communication station, a diplomatic relay station, there was the Voice of America towers, and then there was the Omega navigation system for ships and submarines, etc. And these were basically worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But we did cover last time how there seemed to be this abrupt about face from the first Bush administration in 1990 in the NSC Deputies Committee meetings, where at first, when the Liberian crisis broke out, they were talking about how all of the agencies that were asked in these meetings about their installations, all of them stress that they're incredibly valuable, virtually irreplaceable. It would cost hundreds of millions of dollars to replace these things. But then word comes down, as the violence and the chaos is getting worse, word comes down from the big dogs, namely National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft and George H.W. Bush himself, that we are not going to meddle in this Liberia thing at all. Everybody get your hands off of it. We don't want to be associated with it whatsoever. Robert Gates, who was another NSC deputy, obviously goes in there and says that the historical relationship between the U.S. and Liberia doesn't apply anymore. It's irrelevant. We're going to treat them the same as any other country, which is a very strange about face. I mean, sure, even if we can agree that these are all a bunch of imperialists, it would seem to be in their self-interest to try to protect these several $100 million worth of top-secret military installations. But one factor we can throw in there to explain why suddenly they didn't care so much is this newfangled technology that was coming on the scene in the late 80s and the early 90s, Navstar, aka GPS. And I went looking around to try to see if there was basically any correlation between the development, because actually Charles Taylor says this at his war crimes trial, or he mentions it in passing, that when he was explaining the significance of the Omega Towers, he says, well, nowadays, we have GPS satellites for all this stuff. But back then, you had to have these 8 very tall towers around the world kind of operating in sync to basically allow communication, real-time communication with nuclear submarines and all these other things. But this is right around the time when satellites were becoming a thing. And sure enough, I was reading through the State Department oral histories, and I did find an acknowledgement that that was basically something that was on the Americans' mind. That specifically comes from the Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Liberia in the late 80s, who was serving under Jim Bishop. This is a guy, I am not sure how to pronounce, this feels like a very Midwestern name, but Wauchope. Keith Wauchope was the DCM and the charge d'affaires when his boss, Jim Bishop, was out of the country. This is in the late 80s with Samuel Doe. And so I went and I read his oral history, as we've done with several other people, and he does mention some very interesting things. So he says here, he spends a lot of time talking about the fraught period in the late 80s when the U.S. Samuel Doe relationship started to sour a little bit. We've brought it up a few times here, but this sort of fight over the U.S. sort of imposing financial advisors on Doe's government to sort of get his house in order became a source of great vexation between these two forces. And so a lot of what Wauchope is talking about concerns that, but he mentions, a few very interesting things in that period. So he's talking about the period where Doe launches a campaign to try to embarrass the United States, which I believe he called Operation Payback the United States, because the U.S. had sort of said, well, look how much money we've put into your country over the last 50 years since the Cold War, blah, blah, blah. So in the midst of this, they decide to sort of counteract what Doe is saying. He says, quote, "We decided to calculate what it costs to run the U.S. mission on Liberia to show what we contributed to its economy. We came up with a figure of $32 million a year to operate. This included our local payroll and what we expended for fuel and electricity. We came up with a figure of $32 million a year to operate. This included our local payroll and what we expended for fuel and electricity. The fuel bill alone was over $6 million. We had 6 big generators at the VOA plant that generated power for the transmission towers. We paid for electricity and for telephone service, whereas the government and all its branches never paid for its utilities. We had to pay for them, and we paid in hard currency. So, we informed the Liberians of this $32 million to give them some sense of the tangible benefit of this relationship. To a certain extent, it had a beneficial effect. And here's the important part right here. In addition to this valuation, we advised the Liberians of the technological transition taking place, as had been the case in Asmara. The Omega navigational system was being replaced by satellites, and ships were now able to get their navigational bearings by satellite. Likewise, the communications relay facility was going to satellite as well, and they didn't need ground stations to the same extent. It was convenient to us to retain these facilities. It was less expensive than having to launch a satellite. We calculated that, as long as we could keep these operating, so much the better. There was one irreplaceable, or at least difficult to replace activity, and that was the agency diplomatic communications service facility, which had technicians on the ground to service posts throughout the region. They were right in the region, and they could respond quickly, and they knew the area. Of course, it could be moved back to Washington, but there would be a loss of response time, it would be slower and more expensive, but you could do that if you had to. We told the Liberians, look, if you press the rents issue, we'll just shut down our operations altogether. There were hundreds of Liberians employed by these facilities as well. They hemmed and hawed, and they kept this sort of Damocles over our head throughout this entire period. So there you go right there. That's an indication that even around 1988, they already had in the back of their mind, and there were probably strategic assessments done that these facilities were not going to be necessary forever, especially if the Cold War against the Soviets was about to wrap up. And you can hear in his attitude that it sounds like there's been like a cost-benefit analysis that's been done, and people have determined that as long as they can keep those things going the way they're already operating, then sure, that's prudent, but if the Liberians dare to do something as out of pocket as talk about charging more rent for the facilities that they rent to the Americans, then they basically are saying, we don't give a shit. Burn it all down. We'll just leave. And I could imagine that to some of these Liberians in politics that perhaps maybe they saw that as more of a bluff than what it actually was in 1988. They thought the Americans might say that, but these are really critical top secret installations. They're not just going to let them get burned down or looted. But that is exactly what happened. And just as Liberia devolves into total chaos and those installations are abandoned, the American Navstar system is right there to pick up the slack. In fact, the first modern Block 2 GPS satellite was launched in February 1989, and the Gulf War of 1990 was the first conflict in which the military widely used GPS. And it was in December 1993 when the GPS system first achieved initial operational capability with a full constellation of 24 satellites. So that's one aspect of GPS and satellites that weirdly ties the mysterious Heinrich to what was going on in Liberia. But there's actually one other bizarre satellite angle, and it actually kind of goes back to BCCI as well. And this is something that in all the books I've read about this period of Liberian history, I hadn't seen anybody really talk about it. But all of these embassy guys, both Jim Bishop and Keith Washope, both zero in on this as being a very big deal and a big factor into why they really fell out of favor with Doe. And before I read this part from his State Department oral history, try to remember the video that Prince Johnson made after he had captured Samuel Doe. What did Johnson and his men keep asking him over and over and over again until he finally dies? Where's the Liberian people's money? What did you do with the Liberian people's money? Now, given the habits of people in Samuel Doe's government skimming lots of money, that's certainly a fair question to ask, but given that this is a group that is in radio contact with the U.S. Embassy, and I think we've laid out, seems to have been a part of some U.S. plot, it almost feels like that was a central point of the interrogation, and maybe they were even encouraged by the Americans to torture him and get him to say where he put away all the Liberian people's money. So listen to this. This is a little bit of a curveball. Washope goes on to say, as we tightened up on his government's fiscal operations through these financial experts, Doe became susceptible to other kinds of schemes. He became involved in several money-making schemes, which was a concern to us because of the potential embarrassment to him in the U.S. One was the establishment of the Meridien Bank, which already operated in several other African countries. It was supposedly U.S.-based, a U.S.-chartered bank, giving them access to help from our embassies. We wondered with the collapse of the Liberian economy and the inefficiencies and corruption, why would a bank open here and build a very fancy office building in Monrovia? We learned that it was financing a satellite ground reception operation. We found out subsequently that this was about a $4 to $6 million project for which the government of Liberia borrowed $16 million to pay for. The rest of it was to be shared among Liberian government officials and those in the bank. It seemed clear that Meridien was involved in the business of assisting the government in these shady financial transactions. We were suspicious from the beginning, and I had to go look up exactly which company he was referring to, and I was able to find it. The company was called Spar Aerospace. They were Canadian, and they were building something called the Jonestown Earth Station in Painesville, which eventually would be totally trashed and looted through the two Liberian civil wars. As a footnote, about 3 years ago, I was asked to testify as an expert witness about how business was done in Liberia in that period to show that the Meridien Bank was a fraudulent operation as best we could determine. They flaunted the fact that they were chartered in the U.S., and they asked and, to a certain extent, received our support for their activities. We would attend their functions, and they would consult with us about their activities. We just tried to fathom why they were doing any of these things at this time in Liberia. In any event, when I testified as an expert witness, the question was, how did they do business? I testified that all of these organizations that came to do business in Liberia would have to make some sort of an arrangement with Doe and to the people around him. So, it seemed likely that this was the case with the Meridien Bank. By this time, the Meridien Bank was suing the successor government of Liberia for $86 million in repayment of this $16 million loan with interest and penalties. Of course, Meridien was looking for some kind of settlement to recover some money out of this deal. I'm not sure how it came out, but my sense is that with my testimony and that of others, it became apparent to the Meridien representative's lawyer that it was unlikely that Meridien would receive anything. Meridien by this time was bankrupt, and it was really their creditors who were trying to squeeze some money out of the Liberian government. It was just one of those corrupt initiatives in this period. And our questioner asks him, "Did you go back to Washington and say, 'Who are these Meridien people?'" He says, "Absolutely. They were chartered out of Delaware or something like that. But their base of operations was the Bahamas, and they were operating. I remember one of their locations was in Zambia, and there were a couple of other African capitals, but they were always in the fringe states, not the nations with real economic prospects. They were operators who were prepared to take greater risks on loans than most traditional banks would. They charge higher rates in this process as well. Their game was to hike the amount of loan involved and then split the overage with the host government officials, and then whatever the modest real costs were covered by in nominal repayments. I remember there was a contractor who was to build an underground water line to a facility near Painesville. They claimed that it would cost $4 million to put this line in. Somebody looked at the project and said it should cost $800,000. The markup on these kinds of deals was often 400%, way out of line with reality. The expectation was that no one would look closely at the cost to run a water line for a half mile at a $4 million. Now here's another name that's popped up a little bit. Of more concern to us was an individual named Gus Kuenhoven, who set up shop at the Hotel Africa, a hotel outside of the city along the beach that had a legal casino. He apparently was Swiss. Fact check. Kuenhoven is actually Dutch. We developed information that Mr. Kuenhoven was laundering drug money, and what better way than in some African casino in a country with a large Lebanese community. The Lebanese loved to gamble, and money was flowing in and money was flowing out, and no one knew where it came from or where it went. Kuenhoven seemed to be very tight with President Doe. It seemed likely that he was paying Doe to allow him to operate in Liberia. Probably the shadiest deal of all was when we got wind through the CIA station. It was a group that came to talk with Doe and exchange presents. Doe was a great collector of expensive watches, among other things. They wanted to set up an illegal drug production and trafficking operation. They were going to make narcotics and then ship them from Liberia to Europe and elsewhere. Once we heard about that one, we had to decide to thwart the plan without compromising our source. We handled it in such a way that we sent the word back through various channels that we gotten wind of this scheme. The message was that if the president were even to contemplate this operation, that we would blow the whistle and he would completely lose credibility and all the U.S. assistance. We learned that the word got to him and the scheme didn't go anywhere, but this was the degree to which Doe had been reduced to contemplate any kind of activity like that. So yeah, hold up there. Doe starts apparently getting into bed with a bank I had never heard of before called the Meridien Bank in the late 80s. And this is something that seems to have caused great consternation from the U.S. State Department officials on the ground. And from the way they talk about it, it sounds almost like an absolute clone of BCCI, a bank that was actually chartered in Luxembourg, but also was registered in Delaware, but also was owned by a shell company in the Bahamas, and through all of these shell within shell kind of companies, had absolutely opaque ownership and operated primarily in the third world, and was offering its personal banking services to various strongmen, leaders, and presidents like Samuel Doe. I did a little digging up, and sure enough, to some extent that is kind of what it is. It almost seems like a BCCI for Africa in particular, and it was founded by a Cypriot, a man born in Cyprus, who ended up in Zambia, so a white man named Andrew Sardonis, who in a way is kind of like a white Aga Hassan Abadi living in Africa, who was a fierce supporter of the anti-colonial struggle and very much pitched his Meridien with an E, like the French style, bank, to all of these different countries as a way to kind of get in on the action, because similar argument to Abadi and BCCI, these basically Western, white European, American banks have been dominating international finance, and finally it was time for the global South to rise up. Unfortunately, it met something of a similar fate to BCCI and suddenly fell apart in 1995, taking millions of dollars from various countries with it. So based on Washup's recounting of all of this, and also Jim Bishop spends a good amount talking about how this is a big problem for him. He says this shady bank, and he specifies that because they were an American bank, they couldn't really do anything about it. Like, these guys were kind of protected. And once again, sounds like BCCI, who illegally bought an American bank, First American Bank shares, to sort of operate in the U.S. It sounds like something similar was going on here. But it's also strange to me because in all of this intrigue and suspicion, probably well-deserved by the U.S. State Department people about this bank that, was sort of nebulously based out of the Bahamas and Delaware, coming and opening up and starting to do business in Liberia in the late 80s, they find that to be incredibly suspicious. But, as it turns out, there was another very similar bank that was doing the exact same thing in Liberia during that time, and that was BCCI. And they don't bring up BCCI as being a potential problem, even though they were just as obviously shady. And in fact, given Jim Bishop's background in the Chad operations, I feel like he would be the type of person that potentially would already know exactly what BCCI was. And maybe that's why they don't really bring it up, because nobody knows what the Meridien Bank is anymore in the United States, but maybe a few people still remember BCCI. And so I wanted to go back and just double check exactly what was the direct relationship between the Liberian government and BCCI in the 1980s. And weirdly, if you type it into Google, nothing even comes up. And it wasn't until I went back into the other book about BCCI called False Prophets that I remembered there are several mentions of Liberia in there and Samuel Doe. And they did, in fact, have an office set up in Monrovia. And not only that, but there were a few weird things going on. And not only that, most important of all, there are some deep connections between BCCI and Liberia that go back decades. And it all circles around, I think, the thing we brought up back in Demon Forces 1, which is the Liberian Shipping Registry. And we discovered, while doing Contra 6 about BCCI, that the Liberian Maritime Registry, which was set up by Secretary of State Edward Stettinius Jr. in the late 40s, was run, and always has been, and still to this day, is run out of the suburbs of Washington, D.C. But in particular, back in those early days, it fell under the control of this institution called the International Bank of Washington, D.C., which was run by this very interesting individual, Major General George Olmsted. And this International Bank was a strange company. It was one of the few banks or holding companies that had a special charter where it could operate in more than one state, because, quaint as it seems now, back before, I think, the 1980s, it actually was illegal for a bank to have branches in more than one state. Shocking, I know. But this was sort of a special bank overseen by this guy who was a general in World War II, who was also an insurance executive and very, very well connected. The relevant thing is that International Bank eventually acquired this other bank called Financial General Bank Shares. That company would gradually be sold off to a different group of investors, including BCCI fixer and Jimmy Carter's best friend, my good friend Bert Lance, who got involved in a few scandals when Carter was in the White House, and a group of wealthy businessmen and quasi-spooks named, sort of colloquially called the Mittendorf Group. And that group of investors, which eventually got a controlling share in FGB, turned around and sold that bank to a group of Middle Eastern frontmen who were basically acting as cutouts for BCCI, which was illegal when it happened in 1982, and eventually, when the whole scandal blew up, caused the downfall of some of these people. But then that bank became First American Bank Shares in Washington, D.C., a seemingly legitimate bank, but it actually was sort of a puppet cutout for BCCI. But that always stuck with me, because the narrative of the time, to the extent that it did get any fair play in the media, tended to be along the lines of these scary Muslims with all this oil money are coming and they bought one of our banks and they've infiltrated and corrupted all our politicians and stuff, and, you know, they have kind of the run of the place and blah, blah, blah. I don't think that the American elites were that helpless and innocent and were just getting snookered by all these Saudi intelligence officials and businessmen, including Haith Faraon and intelligence chief Kamal Adham, who, by the way, it's mentioned in one of the BCCI books, is the uncle of both Prince Turki bin Faisal and Prince Bandar bin Sultan, which might explain their close involvement as young men getting into this whole underworld. But the main thing that always jumped out at me was that the Liberian Shipping Registry, which is really essentially the Delaware for international shipping, where no questions are asked, few records are kept, and people can go about their business in a very discreet way. The fact that the sort of private entity that ran the Liberian Shipping Registry was run out of suburban Virginia, and specifically was owned by this bank that birthed the creature that would become part of BCCI, it starts to make my head spin a little bit. Because once I started looking back at a lot of the people that were involved in BCCI, especially in the 80s, you start to see some interesting overlaps and interlocks pop up between all of them, particularly in the Saudi connection, and that once again brings us right back to Gerhard Mertins. Remember Prince Turki's assistant, Ahmed Badeeb, Osama bin Laden's high school teacher, was given a part of Mertins' estate as collateral for a deal they had made in the early 90s. Also recall that during Mertins' Iran-Contra transactions, getting arms from Poland, one of the people that helped set up that whole deal was a known associate of Abu Nidal. And Abu Nidal is another name that pops up in the entire BCCI scandal as one of the terrorist groups, basically, that BCCI was managing money for. So, once again, Gerhard Mertins seems to be swimming very closely in all these BCCI circles. But, interestingly, at the same time, if you start to look for any kind of journalism or any kind of book or anything on the internet that contains the words Gerhard Mertins and BCCI, as far as I've looked, you're not going to find anything. The only real clue stitching these things together is the mysterious character of Heinrich, who might be Gerhard Mertins, and also Arif Durrani. Now, as it turns out, there's actually an even better source that still doesn't get us all the way there, but gives us more information on why Arif Durrani called himself Merex, how well he knew Gerhard Mertins, etc., because, of course, it bears repeating, Arif Durrani, he was prosecuted and convicted for selling prohibited aircraft parts to Iran as part of the Iran-Contra scandal, but the financial part of that entire deal was done through BCCI, so it's necessarily connected. But I did manage to find a different article from New York Magazine. I think this is a very interesting article, and it dips into a lot of things that private warriors would eventually get into. Now, this is from December 1991, called Arms and the Man, Did Convict Arif Durrani Help Set the Stage for Iran-Contra by Christopher Byron. So this journalist went to interview Durrani in prison. He talks about something that's a big subject in Silverstein's Private Warriors, this company called Geomilitech that is closely connected to General John Singlaub. We don't have enough time to talk about that today, but I will circle back another time to it. But just to give you some little passages here that mention Merex. It says, Durrani himself was as slippery as anyone. In 1984, he formed a Los Angeles-based company called Merex Corporation. He did not pick the name out of the blue. He chose it, one might suppose, to cash in on the fame of a much larger company of the same name, Merex Incorporated, with offices in Alexandria, Virginia, and Königswinter, Germany. Founded in 1963 by Gerhard Mertins, a legendary figure in the international arms trade, Merex of Germany and its affiliated companies have been used over the years by intelligence services around the world, the CIA included, for all sorts of secret arms deals. During Iran-Contra, the company appears to have helped, quote, front a shipment of East Bloc arms to the Contras. The arms were apparently obtained initially by one of the scandal's central figures, former General Richard Secord. By adopting the same name for his own operation, Durrani apparently hoped a bit of the German arms legend's mystique would rub off on him, a ploy that not only didn't work, but also seems to have infuriated Mertins. He says he never heard of Durrani until the Pakistani arms trader started promoting himself as the, quote, real Merex. Whatever the facts, while war raged in Iran, Durrani cut a dashing figure across Europe, relishing the attention that representatives of the Revolutionary Guards would lavish on him wherever he went. Unfortunately for Durrani, those days vanished on the afternoon of October 3, 1986. Stumbling into a trap set by the U.S. Customs Service, Durrani was arrested outside a Danbury, Connecticut warehouse and charged with plotting to ship Hawk missile components abroad without a license. That's what he got caught for, and then of course at his trial, his defense was basically that yes, I did it, but this was part of an approved Reagan administration initiative, basically. The jury did not buy that. He went to prison. But the article does say a little further down that since his conviction, Durrani has tried one ploy after the next to get a new trial, or at least to get his sentence reduced. In an attempt to establish his innocence, Durrani even claimed at one point that his company, Merex Corporation, was the same Merex the CIA had been using for years. And in Private Warriors, it did say, contrary to what Mertins claims in this article, that Mertins and Durrani did do business in the late 70s and the early 80s before Durrani adopted the name Merex. It's very murky, but at the same time, I mean, this was not a simple case of a guy stealing a name from somebody, from a more famous person in his field that he's never met. They did know each other. At the same time, maybe, they did have a falling out, but either way, they had done business in the past. They were both working on Iran-Contra arms shipments during the 80s. Both had strong connections to Pakistan. I mean, you could go down the list. These people are not unconnected to one another. And yet, Gerhard Mertins' name never came up during the explosion of the BCCI scandal in 1991, when he was hard at work making sure there was a very hot civil war in Liberia. And by this point, Sierra Leone as well, I think it's safe to assume. Because if guns were going from Taylor to the RUF, as Nino Brown said, ain't no Uzis made in Harlem or Monrovia. So maybe Gerhard Mertins' absence from the entire BCCI narrative was because he wasn't done doing covert operations. In fact, he was in the midst of his last crusade. And in fact, maybe, I'm just spitballing here, but given that Heinrich came out so late in the game to spill the beans to Time magazine, if that was Mertins, then perhaps that was a clever ploy to make sure that his name did not end up in the papers, because after all, he was a valuable and highly confidential source. In fact, he had snuck into the Soviet Union and photographed top-secret documents that could have gotten him killed. And if he had been caught, and the Soviets had figured out who he was working with, could have even caused an international scandal in those last months of the Cold War. Time magazine sends Nazi war hero arms dealer in to spy on Soviet satellite program. That's a pretty bad headline, but it gives Time magazine every incentive in the world to never publish the true identity of Heinrich, and so he gets to stay in the shadow world, right where he likes it. I can't say that's exactly what happened, but in terms of a rough working theory, that feels consistent with Gerhard Mertins' behavior. And honestly, while there are other Germans floating around, like Ernst Werner Glatt actually gave interviews and was profiled in the late 80s. I found an article in Forbes magazine talking about him. He did not particularly hide his relationship with the U.S. government or his work as an arms dealer, and also he lived in a farm in rural Virginia that I believe he called the Black Eagle Farm, that once had been owned by one of Thomas Jefferson's granddaughters. And so when the book Outlaw Bank describes one that even their sources inside the government can't get a handle on who this Heinrich guy really is. They can't even figure out what year he was born, or where he came from, or even really what his real name is. And on top of that, he kept having to fly over from Europe. We know that Mertins had homes in the U.S., but he was mostly still based in Germany, whereas Glatt, who was younger than him, pretty much openly lived in Virginia and was pretty reachable. So I don't think it would be Glatt, though he was up to plenty of shady shit. And also, I don't think it was one of Gerhard Mertins' sons, because they would have been probably in their 30s, maybe early 40s, but by all accounts, it sounds like the character of Heinrich is an older, bespectacled man. Beatty says he can't quite tell how old he is, but he suspects he might be 10 years younger than what he looks like. And of course, knowing everything we've gone over today about the very storied background of Gerhard Mertins, his antics as a Nazi paratrooper, his service for the Gehlen Org, his friendship with Colonia Dignidad, I would definitely believe that if Gerhard Mertins was wading into a situation with journalists, that he would probably go to some pretty extreme measures to cover up his entire past. It's like how we'll never, ever figure out what Peter Thiel's grandfather did between 1933 and 1945. Certain Germans have a way of burying that shit very deep, because obviously they know a lot of people around the world don't like it so much and don't trust Nazis. So I would say I'm about 98.9% convinced that for whatever reason, Gerhard Mertins made himself a source for Time magazine, and maybe in doing so, kept him out of the limelight when these Pakistanis and Arabs and even a couple Americans went down in the collapse of BCCI. Meanwhile, Mertins gets to dive right into West Africa just as it's sliding into apocalyptic civil war and make an absolute killing and do whatever his real mission is. But there's one more little BCCI Liberia thread that I just have to pull on because I stumbled upon it the other day, and it gave me such a chill, though I can't be entirely convinced if it means anything or if it's just a strange, bizarre coincidence. But I was flipping through the third book about BCCI that we relied on for Contra 6 just to see if there was anything else. And this is Abdullah John's From BCCI to ISI, The Saga of Entrapment Continues. And this is arguably the spiciest and also the least rigorously sourced and footnoted book that we covered. But I think it's kind of bold in what it asserts in charting a connection between the scandal of BCCI and the events of September 11th. Now, we're not going to get into that yet, but I was reading about the U.S. government sting operation called Operation Sea Chase, which started happening in early 1987 in Tampa, Florida. There was a U.S. Customs agent, Robert Mazur, who went undercover at the Tampa branch of BCCI and essentially entrapped the officials at this bank into laundering what they thought it actually was drug money, but basically they were aiding and abetting money laundering, et cetera, and they were able to get limited convictions, mostly for immigrant employees of the Tampa branch only, and I think a handful of Pakistani employees and Arab employees ended up getting slapped with real prison sentences. But of course, it was very contained, and BCCI was kind of allowed to survive for a few more years before it finally really blew up in 1991. But I was just going back over the details of this honestly slightly suspicious sting operation, because Agent Mazur claims that he was kind of just wandering around Tampa one day and he saw a big BCCI sign and thought, oh, that's an international bank, maybe I'll go and trap them. And he just happened to stumble into the most corrupt money laundering bank of the era. It's not, some people suspect that this was almost deliberately designed to sort of control demo BCCI. Right around the time, this is February 87, so this is a few months after Iran-Contra was exposed, when Eugene Hasenfuss's plane, who was also, I think, working for BCCI, or he was paid through BCCI, basically his plane was shot down by the Sandinistas, and the Iran-Contra scandal was first exposed to the public. So it's like about 3 months after that, and only about, I think, 2 months before Bill Casey, CIA director, suddenly has a stroke right before he's supposed to testify to Congress, and then can't speak anymore, and then dies. That's when Operation Sea Chase pops off. And, you know, I'm reading about it and trying to see if there's anything that the other books don't have. And then I come across this passage. On April 7, 1987, Mazur met Mora and told him bluntly that in the future, business would be routed through the BCCI in Panama, which would eventually increase the profits. Mazur bragged at this stage of the entrapment process that he had been doing business with BCCI, quote, for a long time, and exaggerated his relationship with it, claiming that previously the bank had opened accounts for him all over the world. Mora, the employee, listened and accepted the offer, since his earnings had already increased tenfold without much effort. However, he suggested opening the account with a Swiss bank rather than BCCI, but Mazur was adamant about his proposal. This suggests that entrapment of the BCCI was planned from the beginning and was no accidental choice, as Mazur had claimed. At a lunch on April 8, 1987, Agent Mazur introduced Mora to Argudo, manager of BCCI, and talked at length about money laundering. Agent Abreu described the occasion as of, quote, a social nature. This is at odds with previous meetings between Mazur and Mora. However, it is important to note that, unlike in the case of other defendants, with whom all meetings were duly taped, the U.S. government claimed to not have taped these meetings with Argudo, a U.S. citizen, or David Miller, BCCI employee and U.S. citizen. This suggests the possibility that these two employees of BCCI may have worked for the U.S. government as inside sources, in roles similar to that of Rita Rosansky at the Florida National Bank. Additionally, in 1987, midway through Operation Sea Chase, both Argudo and David Miller left the BCCI and transferred into new jobs with other American banks. Even though they were involved in the conspiracy as much as other employees of the BCCI, neither of them was indicted nor charged for what they allegedly said or did. This is further indication that they may have had an ongoing working relationship with the U.S. government. Mazur wanted another piece in place. he contacted a Panama City lawyer, Miguel Sanchez, and created another fake Panamanian company, IDC International. Coupled with his new relationship with BCCI, the company would put him in a position to move funds offshore directly. On August 13, 1987, David Miller helped Mazer in opening an IDC operational account in Panama. No funds from illegal proceeds had been wired through the BCCI as yet, nor had this been proposed to any BCCI employee. So there you have it. David Miller on the inside of BCCI. Now hopefully you recognize that name from the great Emmanuel Bowier's TRC testimony, although I hate to admit it, I have no idea if the David Miller referred to here is in fact David Charles Miller, former U.S. ambassador and future National Security Council staffer, the guy who told the Liberian delegation in 1990 that there was going to be a war. It was going to reach Monrovia, and a quarter of your population is going to be wiped out. I have never flipped back faster to the endnotes of a book as when I read that line. And unfortunately, the endnotes in this book are not very well delineated, so it's not even clear which exact source the author got this David Miller thing from. And it's also interesting because the two other books I read, while they don't really focus as much on Operation Sea Chase itself, none of them mention a David Miller at all. But I just want to throw some things out there for you and remind you of what David Charles Miller was up to in 1987. Now, it's true that I've looked through his resume, I've read all of his State Department oral history, and nowhere does it say that David Charles Miller ever worked for BCCI. But if you'll remember when I was reading about how he ended up on the National Security Council, he did talk about how after he left his ambassadorship, he came back to the States and he got into finance for a little while, and he gathered a group of investors who were friends of his, including the venerable General Brent Scowcroft, and they invested in a number of businesses, including some in Florida. I think it may have been a trucking company in Florida, and honestly a bunch of very random sounding things kind of around the country. He didn't get too much into it except to say that he would go over and talk finance business with Brent Scowcroft regularly, and also relish picking Scowcroft's brain about this or that global issue that was going on at the moment. And then it was either at the very end of 1988, after George H.W. Bush won the presidency, or very early in January of 1989, when Scowcroft invites Miller to the Metropolitan Club and basically says, I want you on the NSE staff, covering terrorism, arms trafficking, and then Africa got thrown into the mix as well. And then he ends up joining the National Security Council, and I think stayed through the end of 1990, and then he left. So that means that if David Charles Miller was an ambassador in Africa in 1987, then that would probably make it very unlikely that he was doing some kind of weird thing in Tampa, Florida with BCCI. But as it turns out, he was working in the field of finance during those exact years, and then it would seem, according to this one book, poofs away and doesn't get prosecuted or anything else, and appears to maybe have been an informant placed in there from the beginning to entrap other people. That makes it a little bit more liminal. And while we're on the subject of David Charles Miller, I think it would be a good time to also bring up another little oral history that I've been reading from our good friend Bob Gates, who of course was Bill Casey's deputy at the CIA during Iran-Contra, and then ended up on Brent Scowcroft's National Security Council. He proposed what Jim Bishop said was the most disgusting thing he had ever heard in his years of the Foreign Service, where Bob Gates said, can't we just evacuate these African-American U.S. citizens from Liberia to, Ivory Coast or something and put them in tent camps? Basically didn't want to bring them back to the United States because the Bush administration felt that it would look bad politically to drop them off in South Carolina because they thought they would all go on welfare. I agree with Bishop. That's incredibly disgusting. But Bob Gates gave his own kind of oral history, not to the State Department, but to another center. It's actually to the Miller Center, no relation. And large parts of it are redacted, which is kind of funny, including around this period where he was on the NSC. But there was one little passage in there that I thought was very intriguing. So here we go. This is Robert Gates talking. He says, he's talking about the interpersonal relationships in Bush's cabinet and National Security Council, and he's really praising it overall, especially compared to the Reagan administration and others, for how tight and on the same page everybody was. I mean, and let's remember, we're talking about George H.W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Brent Scowcroft, Colin Powell, John Sununu, the Chief of Staff, Larry Eagleburger, Robert Swan Mueller III, Condoleezza Rice, Paul Wolfowitz, future Attorney General William Barr, and James Baker III, his Secretary of State, a man who knows where many skeletons are buried. But these guys were all tight. But Bob Gates says, towards about the last year, we hired one of these people who was kind of high maintenance. He was a good guy and a smart guy, and we hired him on Africa. I think his name was David Miller. I'm not sure, but I think that's right. And Miller was an activist. He wanted to do a lot of things, and he wanted to run a lot of things. He was in charge of both Africa and terrorism, counterterrorism, and for some reason guys who hold the counterterrorist brief at the NSC somehow, there's something in the water over there that gets into them. He was very close to Scowcroft. He and Brent were very close friends. I spent more time keeping him corralled than I spent on the entire rest of the staff. And you never have to testify in front of Congress. The administrative things were really very, very modest. And the interviewer asks him, just for the sake of future historians, can you remember a bad idea that this gentleman came up with that you had to get rid of? Gates says, he, David Charles Miller, always had these great ideas for snatching terrorists overseas. You know, kidnapping them and bringing them back to the U.S., and he'd get people all keyed up around the bureaucracy and so on, and I'd get a call from Colin Powell or Dave Jeremiah, and they'd say, do you know what this guy is doing? And I'd say, oh no. And I'd basically, part of the problem was that I had a problem with bringing terrorists back to the U.S. to stand trial anyway, because I think it's generally a bad idea, because I'm always scared to death a good lawyer would get one of them off, and here we are, we'd have kidnapped somebody out of a sovereign country, created a huge diplomatic flap, and then the guy walks. So I just, in principle, had a problem with that, and he was constantly trying to come up with one of these schemes. Generally, he'd go to Brent. Brent was usually very phlegmatic about things like that. He very rarely would say, that's a terrible idea, on things like this, because he'd figure out it would never go anywhere, and he'd just, why burn up any capital in a personal relationship or anything? He kind of counted on me to make sure nothing ever happened. So, that's interesting right there. David Charles Miller, Gates sums him up as an activist who was high maintenance and hard to control. He wanted to do a lot of things, and he wanted to run a lot of things. And he was in charge of both Africa and terrorism, counterterrorism, etc. Now that's interesting because the way David Charles Miller tells his own story is that Brent Scowcroft invited him to the Metropolitan Club and basically explained what a shit show the NSC had been under Reagan, especially in those later years, right before Iran-Contra blew up, where you had these egos and factions of Caspar Weinberger, Alexander Haig, and then you had Ollie North doing his thing, and people were not necessarily, even though they were all working towards the same broad, nefarious objective, they were all kind of off the reservation doing their own thing. I mean, Bill Casey was practically running his own State Department, doing his own diplomacy and covert ops, like not checking in with even Reagan a lot of the time, and using networks of people like his Hardy Boys to just totally circumvent whatever minimal guardrails there were at the CIA for, say, like assassinating people. Casey was a man of action and stuff. But the weird thing is when Miller talks about his conversation with Scowcroft, Scowcroft lists all of these kind of staid good virtues of prudence and discretion and all these other things, qualities that generally, Miller says, may or may not apply to me. And so he's sort of painting it as that, not that Scowcroft doesn't want to do covert ops, but he wants them done much more quietly, and as Poppy Bush would say, prudently and responsibly, than this kind of Ollie North shit that was going on that got a lot of them in trouble and, almost cost Bush the White House in '88, though he was very skillfully able to kind of skirt the whole issue. So, on the one hand, Miller seems to either think of himself or he's presenting himself as this cool, calm, collected kind of guy that's going to go in there and be responsible. But then Bob Gates remembers him as kind of this psycho that was constantly trying to kidnap people and do these daring, like, special ops. And honestly, God knows what else, right? Because he did have the Africa portfolio during the exact years when the Liberian Civil War popped off. And remember the other things he said to the Liberian delegation? He said, you see that phone over there when they were sitting in Oliver North's old office? You see that phone over there? I could pick that up right now and call Taylor and stop him in his tracks. But I'm not going to do it. Remember the other thing he said? We know that Samuel Doe went and got some second-rate weapons from Romania when Ceausescu was still around. They definitely didn't like that. We also know that Charles Taylor went and got some superior weapons from Spain. We know where all the guns are going and coming from and everything else, except in occasional cases, and then we eventually find it out later. But generally, he's telling the Liberian delegation, we're aware of everything that is going on. All of the shadow world flows we have our eyes on. And thinking in the context of all of this Iran-Contra stuff, of course they do, because they're the ones sending most of the arms around everywhere, right? So while I can't say, based on that circumstantial evidence, that David Charles Miller was doing some kind of strange work with BCCI in the late 80s, right before he popped back into the White House, I think it's something that we have to consider. One final little factoid about David Charles Miller that I found when I was researching him for the last run of episodes, but I think I forgot to mention it. One of the first things that popped up when I Googled his name was on NSA160.com, and I found something called the SOF Fund David C. Miller Jr. Fellowship, which of course stands for Special Operations Fund. This is from 2020, and it says, Ambassador, retired, David C. Miller Jr. is the founder and chairman emeritus of the board of the Special Operations Fund. In recognition and appreciation for his vision and thoughtful guidance of the Special Operations Fund, his lifelong commitment to nurturing future public servants through the power of higher education and distinctive educational experiences, in 2016, the Board of Directors of the Special Operations Fund established the Ambassador David C. Miller Jr. Fellowship Award. This $20,000 scholarship is awarded to eligible college graduates or graduate students of the Joint Special Operations families who wish to study, work, or participate in international charitable or research activities for up to 2 years. Ambassador David C. Miller Jr. has had a distinguished career in public service, diplomacy, business, and management of nonprofit organizations, having earned an American Field Service scholarship to Japan, a Harvard College undergraduate degree, a Juris Doctorate from University of Michigan Law School, and a White House Fellowship, Ambassador Miller was well prepared for a life of leadership and contribution at the national and international levels. After a year in Vietnam working with Harvard and MIT professors, primarily for the Advanced Research Projects Agency, now known as DARPA, Ambassador Miller was selected as a White House Fellow in 1968 and 69, serving with Attorney General Ramsey Clark and then John Mitchell, who asked him to remain another year as a confidential assistant. He continued to serve in the White House from 1970 to 71 as the director of the President's Commission on White House Fellows, while also working with the counsel to the President. Ambassador Miller was the U.S. Ambassador to Tanzania from 1981 to 84 and Zimbabwe from 84 to 86. After 2 years in business, from 86 to 88, he returned to the White House as Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs on the NSC from 1989 to 1990. His NSC portfolio included counterterrorism, counter-narcotics, low-intensity conflict, Africa, the United Nations, refugees, and public diplomacy. During 10 years at Westinghouse Electric Corporation, he held a variety of international positions and has served on a number of corporate boards, both public and private. He is one of the founding members for the U.S. Diplomatic Studies Foundation and serves as its president. Working with the Atlantic Council, where he was the Brent Scowcroft Fellow, he co-authored with ambassadors Tom Pickering and Chester Crocker reports on reform of the National Security Council, followed by a similar report on the Department of State. The Foundation is currently working with the Department of State to improve the education and training of Foreign Service officers. Ambassador Miller is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the District of Columbia Bar, and is the founder of the Special Operations Fund. He was co-author with Howard Wolpe and David Gordon of The United States in Africa, a Post-Cold War Perspective, and he has contributed chapters to 3 books on low-intensity conflict. He received an honorary Doctor of Law degree from Lewis and Clark College in 1991 in recognition of his public service. So, you might be wondering, why did I read that? That sounds so nice. He's giving back to the families of our JSOC operators. What's so bad about that? Well, first of all, David Charles Miller never served in the military. So I find this a little bit, I don't know, the fact that he founded the Special Operations Fund feels unlikely for a man who mostly worked in the State Department and in private business for most of his career. But you notice they mentioned twice there that one of his passions and areas of particular expertise is low-intensity warfare, which may in fact go back to his DARPA Phoenix program days in Vietnam. And apparently, if you go to the actual website of the Special Operations Fund.org, it will tell you that the Special Operations Fund was started on February 14th, 1992 by Ambassador David Charles Miller Jr. after he left the President George H.W. Bush administration. His National Security Council accounts included counterterrorism, counter-narcotics, hostages, Africa, etc., and during this time, he met many quiet warriors serving our country on special missions, many not made public. He promised the commander of Special Operations Command that when he returned to the private sector, he would set up an organization to take care of the families if their warrior didn't come home alive. And the motto of this charity is the Quiet Fund for Quiet Warriors. And the very last thing I'll say about David Charles Miller is that if you recall his conversation with his good friend, Brent Scowcroft, at the Metropolitan Club, Brent Scowcroft laid out a very specific vision for how he wanted to run George Bush's National Security Council. And there's a reason why Scowcroft had such a specific vision, especially around the area of sensitive covert operations. And that's because he served on the first commission that supposedly looked into the Iran-Contra scandal, the Tower Commission. This was a commission set up just 1 month after Eugene Hassenfuss's plane was shot down in Nicaragua. And interestingly, a Lebanese newspaper also published the first story talking about the Iran for hostages deal. But Scowcroft was right up in there, supposedly getting to the bottom of what really happened. And then the report of that commission was, I would say, rather hastily rushed out to the public in February 1987, before even Bill Casey dies, before all of this BCCI stuff starts happening. But there's a name in there that's worth paying attention to: Senator John Tower. For those who listened to our Contra 6 episode, you may remember we read a little passage in Outlaw Bank where one of the whistleblowers was claiming that BCCI had sexual blackmail material on John Tower from one of his trips to Pakistan, where he was cavorting in flagrante with quote-unquote dancing girls. And if you do news searches about John Tower, his reputation as a big drinker and a womanizer is pretty widely attested to across the political world. This is not exactly a big shocking secret at the time. But there are a few very interesting things about John Tower that I just want to leave you with. First of all, like we have talked about a lot recently, John Tower is one of those American politicians who is on the unfortunate list of dying in a suspicious plane crash on April 5th, 1991, in Georgia. Not only that, John Tower was a senator from the great state of Texas. In fact, he found his way into the Senate by running against LBJ in 1960 and then losing, and then when LBJ ascended to the vice presidency, Tower won in a special election. Now, I do not have the time to get into it, but I was trawling some old JFK conspiracy forums, and there are some apocryphal stories about John Tower perhaps knowing some things about what happened in Dallas with John Kennedy in 1963. But even putting that aside, because it's hard to be sure about it, there's another interesting connection, and I will read the most bare summary of summaries from his Wikipedia, but I think this will speak for itself. It says, according to the assassination of Robert Maxwell, Israel's super spy, by Gordon Thomas and Martin Dillon, John Tower became the liaison for Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father, a British publishing mogul and super agent for Mossad, to the White House and to U.S. government operations. The relationship began in 1984, and the soon-to-be-retired Tower, quote, told Maxwell that his fee as Maxwell's personal consultant would be $200,000. Tower received his fee in 4 separate payments of $50,000 into a Swiss bank account. Tower arranged for Maxwell to meet with the leadership of Sandia National Laboratories, a U.S. nuclear lab. Maxwell sold to Sandia a copy of Promise software that had a backdoor which was accessible by Israeli intelligence, giving nuclear details to Israel. Shortly after retirement from the Senate in 1985, Tower took Maxwell's request for American help in arming Iran and relayed it to President Reagan as a means to trade for American hostages held in Lebanon. Quote, 2 days later, the former senator reported to Maxwell that his meeting with President Reagan had produced a positive response. So there's Robert Maxwell getting in the middle of Iran-Contra intrigues as well. And that mention of Promise software. By the way, one of the things Jonathan Beatty says in Outlaw Bank that spooked him was the death of journalist Danny Casolaro, who was working on stories about Promise software and its connections to BCCI. He was also tracking an international network of connected criminals that sounds an awful lot like the BCCI Black Network, but which Casolaro called the Octopus. And Beatty actually had met with him just a week before Casolaro was found dead in a motel room in West Virginia. So all that's a little spooky for Senator John Tower, who would go on to run the commission that got to the bottom of Iran-Contra. It also almost goes without saying that as a senator from Texas circa 1960, he was a longtime friend and associate of George H.W. Bush. And I've read some speculations, though I can't be sure, that after Bush became president, he nominated John Tower to be Secretary of Defense. But then, in a shocking surprise, the Senate voted against his nomination, 47-53, and in the process, dredged up some information about his drinking and his womanizing that was highly embarrassing to him. So John Tower did not get to become Secretary of Defense, and instead, that job went to Dick Cheney. But Bush did put him on the president's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. I'm not sure if he was still on that at the time of his death. But I've also read other things that have speculated that John Tower, who had a very fiery personality, actually felt like George Bush set him up to get humiliated on purpose in the Senate, and maybe felt bitter that since he had done such a good job cleaning up the Iran-Contra mess, that he should get something more out of it than what he did. And so maybe he was even, perhaps in an alcoholic stupor, threatening to go public and talk about certain things. But then his plane crashed in April 1991, so that was no longer a threat. I can't say for sure which versions of those stories might be true or not, but there's one more fact that jumped out at me when I was reading Private Warriors and some other articles by Silverstein. This is a fact that is barely ever mentioned about John Tower, but for the purposes of what we've been talking about today, I think you should be made aware of it. And that is that from 1977 to 1986, Tower married a woman named Lilla Burt Cummings, who just so happened to be the sister of notorious American arms dealer and CIA asset Sam Cummings. So during the peak of the BCCI years and the Iran-Contra years, Senator John Tower was married to Sam Cummings' sister, and then apparently they separated in 1985 and got divorced in July 1986. But that ties us all the way back to our Nazi arms dealer, because Sam Cummings and his other German partner, Ernst Werner Glatt, did business with Merex and Gerhard Mertins back in the 60s. So as you can see, we're getting into a very tight, very interlocked, very sleazy and incestuous world of operatives up here at the top. And while many of the main dramatis personae of Iran-Contra fell off by this period of 1991, either by having sudden strokes or sudden plane crashes or becoming the president, Gerhard Mertins, ever the resourceful paratrooper, mostly managed to dance between the raindrops, right up until he dropped dead of a heart attack on March 19th, 1993 in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, coincidentally 12 days before the book Outlaw Bank by Jonathan Beatty and Sam Gwynn featuring Heinrich is released on April 1st, 1991. I'm certainly not implying that there's any causality to that, but given the way that they describe invoking him in their Time articles from 91, it sounded like Mertins, if he was in fact Heinrich, felt reasonably secure that his identity as a leaker would not be discovered. But when that book came out, on the other hand, and there was relatively much more information about this shadowy individual named Heinrich, I think it would be safe to assume that interested parties, certain black networks or intelligence agencies around the world, would be able to narrow down that very short list of high German arms dealers and figure out which one was talking to journalists. And if they had done the same deductive reasoning that I've done today, even if they weren't correct, I don't think you could fault any black underground network from assuming it was Gerhard Mertins and perhaps retaliating accordingly. On the other hand, he was getting on in years. He had lived a very full life, and maybe the stresses of the game just accumulated and caught up with him on a sunny Florida beach one day in 1991. I'm not sure we'll ever know for sure. But one thing I do know for sure is that the network known as Merex did not die with its founder, Gerhard Mertins. On the contrary, it would grow and come to play very well concealed but critical roles in a variety of conflicts over the next 2 decades, not just in Liberia, not just in West Africa. Unfortunately, the source in Feinstein's book that identifies Charles and his brother Bob Taylor as sales agents for Merex comes from an incredibly obscure Bavarian police document from the 2000s. The footnote reads, Bavarian State Office of Criminal Investigation, report on the Greek citizen Angelos Skordas / Merex, case reference 142-96, volume M-4581-96, Dusseldorf, 11 January 2005. Now, if you try Googling that, in quotes, you will get absolutely nothing. And that highlights a problem that we have where, as far as I've searched, there is no detailed source on how the relationship between Charles Taylor and Gerhard Mertins first came to be. We can certainly speculate about it, and we can see evidence of the Charles Taylor-Merex relationship reverberate throughout the Liberian Civil War in the 90s, as we will see in the next couple episodes. But we know very little about how they met, where they met, who introduced them, which networks were they perhaps mutually a part of. There's basically nothing laid out that states exactly how it happened. And perhaps if I dig deeper into the thousands of pages of Charles Taylor's war crimes testimony in the late 2000s, there might be a mention of Mertins at some point, but if there is, I certainly haven't seen it yet. But we're not totally out of luck, because after Mertins dies in March 1993, like I said, Merex lives on, and several of its agents, including Joe der Hovsepian and a couple other gentlemen that we're going to get into in the very next episode, step into the void and become really the primary weapons supplier for Charles Taylor. And this assumes much more importance, especially vis-a-vis the support they're getting from Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire from their militaries directly. Because in 1991, there is a UN arms embargo placed on all sides of the Liberian conflict. This proves to be a fairly large, but not insurmountable, obstacle for all the rebel forces that are fighting in Liberia. But it does complicate things for Charles Taylor, who now has to rely on even shadowier networks to get the weapons that he needs to win his war. But in the next installment of Demon Forces 5, I'm going to have to throw you another curveball, because if we want to fully understand the dynamics at play in this conflict, especially why a CIA-connected Nazi underground arms-dealing company would be so invested in destroying a country like Liberia, then I think we have to take a look at another country that Merex was very busy helping to literally wipe off the face of the earth in the early 1990s, in this exact same time period with some of the exact same people, and using many of the same exact terrifying tactics. And it may not be a total coincidence that I'm talking about a country that paratrooper Gerhard Mertins invaded in the early spring of 1941, the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, the last remaining socialist country in Europe.
Now, the physical barriers were perfect for the Jonestown setup, and the physical barriers for the Colonia Dignidad were perfect. They were totally isolated. In one case, the Germans only spoke the German language, and they didn't learn Spanish, and they didn't learn any of the history. They wore the clothing of the 1940s, and they kept it a purely physical German environment, which reminds me that when the shipping fleets were built up of Aristotle Onassis and Hjalmar Schacht, the head of the Reichsbank who funded Adolf Hitler, got into funding the Japanese and German fleets of Aristotle Onassis. It turned out that all of Onassis's fleets only had German crews. They only spoke the German language. Not the Greek language, but the German language, and they were all German crews, and they went down to Argentina and Antarctica and South America, back and forth. That's where the Onassis fortune was built up. They had German crews, and the children and the people on the ground of Colonia Dignidad only spoke German and were only allowed to speak German. The first report of Colonia Dignidad being a secret torture detention center came out in February 4th, 1976, before the United Nations, the Economic and Social Council, and they told of its location near a town called Parallel, P-A-R-R-A-L-L, in the Andean Mountains, and a Colonel Espinosa, the chief of CENDEP, that's the Information Center for Political Prisoners, stopped in Parallel and made visits there, and there were 119 prisoners who disappeared, and that many had been recognized as being in Colonia Dignidad. The DINA, that's the Direction de Investigation Nacional, that's the secret police of the Chilean government that was put in by the Central Intelligence Agency, holds prisoners there and has used detainees in there for the secret detention system. A second report came out about Colonia Dignidad in 1976, October the 8th, 1976, and I can see why the UN report of this was suppressed, because Jonestown was started in 73 and it was a continuation or a sister substation, and as I say, goodness knows how many there are, but Jonestown got started in 73 where they could train assassins and experiment on people and their minds and body, and if there were just 119 that disappeared, or admittedly from Dina and the Colonia Dignidad in Chile, we have a death record of 913 down in Jonestown, including UNIS Representative Leo Ryan. Now this October 8th report described this as a Dina center. It was known as Colonia Dignidad. There's a torture center there. This was the report to the United Nations, that it was a specially equipped, placed underground, small, completely soundproof, hermetically sealed cells for prisoners. They took leather hoods over their heads. This was in the UN report. They stuck their faces, the hoods were stuck with chemicals, and as I said before, there were torture cells where they did interrogation. There were closed-circuit radio systems. People were kept naked and tied to the bed, and electric shocks were applied. This was for men and women. There was another exposure in March 1977, a third exposure of Colonia Dignidad that exposed Dina and the torture center, and this went to West Germany, and it was done by Amnesty International. This was the third exposure, and it was written up in Frankfurt, Germany, and it came from Chile. It was a 60-page booklet saying that the isolation, which is one of the comparisons to Jonestown, and the economic independence, another comparison to Jonestown, physically isolated and then not dependent on the economy, where people left town to go to work, where you could see them go back and forth. You couldn't see these zombies at Jonestown, and they didn't interrelate with anyone around them. This article is the 60-page article to Amnesty International said that the social separation, the isolation of this community, and its economic independence made it a good place for a torture camp. It was a component of the secret detention system, and when the coup took place in 1973, that's when the United States government overthrew the Chilean government and put the Nazis into power. Since that time, over 2,000 Chileans had disappeared. That's from 1973 to 1976. And 1973 is when the property was rented in Jonestown in Guyana for Jim Jones, and that was the year of his arrest in Los Angeles, and that was the time when the Attorney General, Evel Younger, and the U.S. attorneys and the city attorney in Los Angeles suppressed the arrest records because he was meant to go down to Jonestown, and some simple lewd arrest thing was not going to interfere with the operation. The same year that the coup took place, that the military junta could use the detention center where Martin Bormann had lived with top Nazis, that was the year that the Jonestown was set up in 73. The report that came out from Amnesty International in 76 showed how the clandestine operation worked, the apparatus worked, and the courts in Germany suppressed the Amnesty International reports. The people from the Colonia Dignidad went to court in West Germany and used the courts to suppress it. Now, the San Francisco Chronicle suppressed stories of Jonestown. The San Francisco Examiner suppressed them. The National Enquirer was suppressing articles. Mark Lane was given $10,000 to praise Jonestown. Charles Gary was praising it. They used Associated Press, United Press to praise it. They used KGO radio stations. And Lane was given $10,000 to praise the agricultural farm at a time when medical experimentation and brainwashing was going on down in Jonestown. It wasn't the agricultural farm they said it was. That's another parallel, that the United States press, like the German press, were in collusion to suppress, taking away individual rights. And certainly, if there's all these unidentified children, there's many unidentified there, and as I say, 199 children unidentified. How did they get there? Whose children were they? And why were the federal courts not protecting at least the children? This wasn't an adult decision here, and it wasn't an adult decision to take these people, they were orphans, and take them down to Chile as a front for a torture department. Funding for this operation in Chile and this Colonial Dignidad came from West Germany, and much of the funding for Jonestown, another parallel, came from West Germany. Mrs. Laden came from Germany, the woman whose husband was in charge of the chemical biological warfare at Proving Grounds at Utah, who's been in the military intelligence chemical warfare division of his adult career and is an agricultural branch of it now, which is the agricultural front for these extermination camps. It's his son that is in jail down in Georgetown for charges of the death at the airport when Leo Ryan was killed. But Mrs. Layton had given admittedly several $100,000 to Jim Jones, but she had a father, still has a father in Germany that was sending money, and also there was another fund coming from Germany to Jonestown. So Germany was funding this organization down in Chile, and Germany was funding a share of Jonestown, and this part has never yet come to the front. Amnesty International's report in 1976 gave at least 4 examples that they had where people lived and survived and left the detention center. One was in January 30th, 1975, where 30 minors were held there. May 75, where German people arrested citizens near a town called Talca and detained them in Colonial Dignidad. These were German-speaking people, not Chilean police, Spanish people, but German-speaking. A third group was held several weeks in Colonia, and in May 76, 38 were arrested and taken to Colonia. Amnesty International had specific cases, and then they had 3 who were tortured who got away finally and out of the country, who were at this orphanage. It's an agricultural center, an orphanage which has underground tortures, which housed the Nazis, that belonged to the Nazi government in Chile. They took the testimony of 3 who got away, and in the courts, when Amnesty International was sued by these people to suppress this information, and you remember how Charles Gary, the attorney, was representing People's Temple to stop lawsuits, stop getting the information out to the public, and Mark Lane was going to take on the protection of the People's Temple because they were being suppressed by the federal government, his usual shtick. People got out of Jonestown and told the State Department, told the congressman what was going on. People got out of Chile and testified about their direct experience, but the courts in West Germany and the news media suppressed the details and wouldn't let the story be told about these people who were tortured.